was having lunch with my fiance's parents who always gaslighted me, saying they have another man who's richer and better suited for their daughter. Her father even invited him over. They danced together and their lips touched. When I tried to stop this, she made excuses saying it was just a friendly kiss. So I simply said, okay, and vanished. Next day, my phone blew up with 52 missed calls. My name is Trevor Blake, and I'm 28 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been playing the role of the agreeable son-in-law, a performance that has become as routine as breathing. I've spent countless Saturday evenings nodding politely through Margaret's lengthy monologues about neighborhood gossip and social events, while enduring Robert's sharp corrections at every family dinner. These interactions had become some kind of ritual carved into stone, an unchanging ceremony that I participated in week after week. Victoria, my wife, would occasionally squeeze my hand under the table when things got particularly awkward or tense. It was her silent acknowledgement that she understood the discomfort I was experiencing. But even that small gesture of solidarity had started to fade over time, becoming less frequent as the months passed. Her mother's voice always seemed to fill every corner of the room with its brisk, pointed, and relentlessly critical tone. When Margaret wasn't dominating the conversation with her observations and judgments, it was Robert stepping in with his cutting one-liners, each one disguised as fatherly wisdom, but delivered with an edge that made me feel perpetually off balance. I kept telling myself that none of it really mattered. I convinced myself that Victoria's love for me was enough to weather any storm, and that her parents would eventually warm up to me given enough time and patience. I believed that persistence would eventually pay off, that if I just kept showing up and being pleasant, they would come to accept me as part of their family. But deep down, I knew the truth was something entirely different. Their coldness had seeped into everything like water through cracks in a foundation. It had permeated not just our family gatherings, but somehow managed to influence the very atmosphere of my relationship with Victoria. And then, there was Nathan, always Nathan, the ghost who haunted every single gathering despite never actually being present. I had never met the guy in person, but he might as well have been seated between us at every Saturday dinner, his invisible presence looming over every conversation. Nathan used to carve the roast beef so neatly, Margaret would say with a wistful smile, passing me the carving knife like she was expecting nothing but disappointment from my efforts. He was so good with Victoria's niece. Remember that, Robert? She'd nudge her husband, who would nod along like he was reminiscing about royalty who had once graced their humble home with their presence. The worst part wasn't even that they mentioned Nathan constantly. What truly ate at me was how Victoria never pushed back against these comparisons. She never said something simple like Trevor is here now, or let's focus on the present. Instead, she would just sip her wine with that practiced calm, tuck her hair behind her ear in that familiar gesture, and smile through it all like nothing was wrong. That particular Saturday evening, something in the air felt different from the moment we arrived. Maybe it was the way Victoria avoided making eye contact with me as we pulled into her parents' familiar circular driveway, the gravel crunching under our tires in the same rhythm it had for years. Or perhaps it was the way her fingers danced nervously on the steering wheel, drumming an anxious pattern that I'd never noticed before. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I was finally reaching the point where I couldn't ignore the weight that pressed down on my chest every single time we made this drive. The front yard was dressed exactly as it always was, with hedges trimmed into rigid geometric boxes that looked more like sculptures than living plants. The flower beds were arranged with an almost unnatural precision, too neat and orderly to feel real or welcoming. The house itself seemed to loom over us as we approached, its windows like eyes watching and judging our every move. Victoria forced what I could only describe as a brittle smile as she unbuckled her seatbelt, the sound of the metal clasp echoing in the sudden silence between us. "Please," she said, her voice carrying a note of exhaustion that I'd been hearing more and more lately, "just don't start anything today." I didn't answer her request. The truth was, I couldn't promise that anymore. Something had shifted inside me, and I wasn't sure I had the energy to keep up the performance of the agreeable son-in-law for another entire evening. Inside the house, Margaret greeted me with all the warmth of a manager greeting an employee she didn't hire and didn't particularly want around. Her embrace was stiff and perfunctory, lasting exactly as long as politeness demanded and not a second longer. She gave my shoes a dismissive glance that somehow managed to convey volumes about her opinion of my fashion choices. "Still wearing those brown loafers, I see," she said, with that familiar smirk that I'd come to recognize as her signature expression of subtle disapproval. Robert was stationed in his favorite chair, reading his newspaper with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was using it as a shield against having to engage in actual conversation. He looked up just long enough to deliver his customary greeting. "Trevor, try not to spill anything this time." I bit my tongue hard enough to taste copper, swallowing the response that wanted to escape. Victoria was already walking ahead of me, weaving between the same furniture arrangements we'd navigated countless times before. The house smelled of rosemary chicken and overpolished wood, scents that should have been comforting, but instead filled me with the same feeling I always had here, like I was a stranger visiting a place I'd never truly be welcome in, despite coming here every month for 4 years. In the dining room, the table was already set with the kind of elaborate care that Margaret took pride in. Elegant silverware gleamed under the chandelier, ornate glasses caught the light, and napkins were folded with geometric precision. 3 candles had been lit despite the fact that it was barely evening, because Margaret firmly believed in what she called proper ambience. I believed in something much simpler, surviving the next 2 hours with whatever remained of my dignity intact. We took our designated seats at the dinner table, a seating arrangement that had become as fixed and unchanging as everything else in this house. Victoria settled beside me. Margaret positioned herself at the head of the table like a queen holding court, and Robert sat across from us, already reaching for his wineglass before the meal had even begun. The conversation started with the usual mundane updates that filled these weekly gatherings. Victoria's recent promotion at work, Robert's endless complaints about his new assistant's incompetence, and Margaret's detailed analysis of her Pilates instructor's messy divorce. I did my best to chime in whenever I could find an appropriate opening in the conversation. I offered comments about Victoria's achievements, nodded sympathetically about Robert's workplace frustrations, and even attempted to engage with Margaret's social commentary. But more often than not, I found myself being smoothly interrupted or simply ignored, as if my contributions were somehow less valuable than the ongoing family dialogue. "Actually," Margaret said at one point, her voice cutting through my attempt to share a relevant story, "Nathan used to have such insightful things to say about career transitions. Victoria, do you remember when he helped you prepare for that Goldman Sachs interview? His advice was absolutely invaluable." Victoria nodded in agreement, and I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. She didn't even glance in my direction, didn't acknowledge that her husband was sitting right there listening to yet another glowing tribute to her ex-boyfriend. The casual way she participated in these conversations about Nathan, as if I weren't even present, had become one of the most painful aspects of these family dinners. I couldn't help myself. I let out a soft laugh. It wasn't born of humor, but rather of complete disbelief at the situation I found myself in week after week. "Well, I guess I can't compete with the ghost of Nathan Penn," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I'd intended. Margaret didn't even flinch at my comment. Her expression remained perfectly composed as she replied, "No one's asking you to compete, Trevor. We're just reminiscing about fond memories. Reminiscing." That's what she called it. This constant elevation of Nathan's memory at my expense. What I experienced as a slow erosion of my presence and worth in this family, she dismissed as innocent nostalgia. It was a continuous reminder that no matter how long I'd been married to Victoria, no matter how many family dinners I attended, I would never quite measure up to the standard that Nathan had apparently set. Robert chose that moment to lift his wine glass in what appeared to be a spontaneous toast. "To good men, wherever they are," he declared with a meaningful look that seemed to encompass everyone at the table except me. That simple gesture, that seemingly innocent toast, became the final straw for me. The knot in my stomach that had been tightening all evening suddenly pulled so tight I could barely breathe. I felt something flicker behind my eyes, a mixture of sadness and sharpness that I couldn't swallow down anymore. I looked around that perfectly set table, taking in the gleaming white china, the polished silver that reflected the chandelier's light, and the faces of people who had never truly seen me. Not really. Victoria was still maintaining that polite smile, chewing slowly as if none of this affected her in the slightest. But I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. What I felt was a bone-deep exhaustion that came from 4 years of Saturday dinners, 4 years of being merely tolerated rather than welcomed. I had genuinely believed that love would eventually smooth over these rough edges, that showing up consistently, helping where I could, and listening patiently would eventually earn me a seat at this table that actually felt like it belonged to me. But no matter how many dishes I helped wash after dinner, no matter how many bottles of wine I brought as gestures of goodwill, I remained the outsider. I was a placeholder, a name they couldn't quite remember when listing Victoria's significant relationships. And the most painful realization of all was that I had allowed this to happen. I had let myself become invisible, all in the name of keeping the peace and being the easy, accommodating husband they could simply ignore. As we passed around dessert apple pie, which Margaret made sure to mention that Nathan used to bake from scratch with his own 2 hands, I came to a profound realization. I simply couldn't do this anymore. Not the pretending, not the silence, not the endless waiting for someone else to finally say, "That's enough," and defend my place at this table. It had to be me. I had to be the one to draw the line. I placed my fork down gently on the dessert plate, the small clink of metal against china seeming unusually loud in the room. My voice didn't rise, and I didn't make a scene. I simply looked up at the faces around me and said with quiet determination, "I think I need some air." Margaret raised an eyebrow at my announcement but said nothing in response. Victoria didn't move from her position beside me, didn't offer to accompany me, or ask if I was all right. Robert merely adjusted his napkin and continued chewing his pie as if nothing had happened. Their complete lack of reaction told me everything I needed to know about how little my presence actually mattered to them. I stood up from my chair and walked out onto the porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind me with a soft thud. The wind outside was cooler than I had expected, biting at my collar and making my eyes sting slightly. But out there in the open air, away from the suffocating atmosphere of that dining room, I could finally breathe properly. For the first time in what felt like hours, my chest expanded fully, and I didn't feel the familiar weight pressing down on me. Standing there on the porch, looking out at the manicured lawn and the distant streetlights beginning to flicker on, I realized something important. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't actually want to go back inside. I didn't want to return to my seat at that table, didn't want to continue the charade of being the polite, accommodating son-in-law who smiled through every slight and swallowed every dismissive comment. I was still processing these thoughts when I heard the familiar creak of the front door opening behind me. It was a sound that seemed too deliberate for a house that was usually managed with such tight control. The laughter and conversation in the dining room dimmed just slightly, the way a room's atmosphere shifts when something unexpected or unwelcome enters the space. I turned around, still in the middle of pouring myself a glass of water from the pitcher I'd brought outside, the amber liquid from the crystal decanter sloshing gently as I moved. And there he was. Nathan, standing in the doorway like a ghost who had somehow been draped in flesh and confidence. He walked into the house without any hesitation whatsoever, as if this place still belonged to him, or perhaps worse, as if he still belonged to it. His coat swung open casually as he crossed the threshold, his arms spread wide in a gesture that radiated complete ease and familiarity. "Margaret," he said with genuine warmth in his voice, "you look younger every time I see you." Margaret's response was unlike anything I had ever heard from her. She laughed, not the tight, controlled chuckle she reserved for my attempts at humor, but a real, bright, delighted laugh that was full of genuine welcome. She reached up to embrace him tightly, the kind of embrace she had never once given me, and kissed his cheek with obvious affection. A slow, cold dread began to unfurl in my chest, creeping up my spine like ice water. Surely this couldn't be happening. Not today, not here, not without any warning or preparation. Then Victoria appeared in the doorway, and my heart sank even further. My wife, the woman who had told me absolutely nothing about this surprise visit, who had given me no mention, no warning, no heads up whatsoever about what was coming. And there she was, not just smiling, but practically glowing with happiness. She moved toward Nathan with a fluidity that spoke of deep familiarity and hugged him like she was greeting an old friend she had missed far too much to admit. Then, "And this detail will be burned into my memory forever." She kissed his cheek too. It was soft, casual, and devastatingly familiar, The kind of gesture that spoke of intimacy and comfort that clearly hadn't faded with time. My hands were still wrapped around the crystal decanter, the glass growing warm beneath my palms, as if my body didn't know what to do with itself in this surreal moment. Nathan said something to Victoria that I couldn't quite make out from my position, and she laughed in response, a sound I hadn't heard from her in months. Margaret touched his arm affectionately as she led him into the dining room, treating him like he was some kind of guest of honor rather than a memory that should have been boxed up and buried under the boundaries of marriage. I stood there in the doorway, completely unseen and forgotten, my heart thudding in my ears like the first warning beats of an approaching earthquake. The casual way they had all welcomed him back into their circle, as if no time had passed at all, as if I hadn't been occupying a space at their table for 4 years, hit me like a physical blow. Robert rose from his seat with obvious enthusiasm to shake Nathan's hand, displaying a genuine smile that I hadn't seen him direct at anyone in months, maybe even years. It was the kind of prideful, approving expression that I had silently begged for through countless subtle gestures and unspoken sacrifices. And there it was, being given freely and immediately to someone else, someone who had simply walked through the door. Nathan clapped Robert on the shoulder with easy familiarity and sat down at the table. My table, the one I had helped set earlier that day. He settled into the chair I had helped pull out for Margaret, at the place setting I had helped arrange, as if nothing about this moment was off balance or inappropriate. The most shocking part was that no one looked toward the kitchen to acknowledge my presence. No one called out to ask if I knew Nathan was coming. No one inquired whether I was okay with this unexpected development. I walked slowly back to the dining room, each step feeling heavier than the last, my legs carrying me forward while my mind reeled with the implications of what I was witnessing. My seat was still waiting for me, but now the entire energy of the room had shifted dramatically, and I had become the outlier in what was clearly their natural dynamic. They were all buzzing with an excitement I had never seen them display before. Old stories were bouncing between them like sacred hymns, shared memories that connected them in ways I had never been part of. Nathan was already deep in animated conversation with Robert about stock portfolios and investment strategies, speaking the language of success and financial acumen that Robert clearly respected. Margaret was enthusiastically recounting the time Nathan had helped organize a holiday charity drive, her voice filled with the kind of admiration she had never shown for any of my efforts. Victoria was nodding along to every word, smiling too much and too softly, her entire demeanor transformed by his presence. I sat down carefully, trying to maintain my composure while my world tilted on its axis. My plate of food had already grown cold during my absence, but I couldn't have eaten anyway. My stomach was a tight knot of questions and something much worse, a crystalline clarity about what I was really witnessing. Nathan was charming, of course he was. That was precisely the danger of men like him. They didn't just enter a room, they absorbed it completely, dominated it effortlessly. In this family's eyes, that natural charisma made him royalty, the golden standard against which all other men would be measured and found wanting. He reached for the wine bottle I had opened and poured earlier, a task that had become my unspoken responsibility every Saturday evening, and served Margaret first. She absolutely beamed at the gesture, as if she were being attended to by visiting nobility. He served Victoria next, and she accepted the wine without any hesitation, as if this was still their natural rhythm, as if nothing had changed between them, despite the years that had passed. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight, Nathan," Robert said, with a warmth in his voice that was never directed toward me, his smile genuine and welcoming in a way that made my chest ache. Nathan waved his hand dismissively, as if his presence was the most natural thing in the world. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied smoothly. "It's always a pleasure being back with family." That word hit me like a physical slap. Family. He said it with such casual confidence, as if he belonged here more than I did. And the most devastating part was that no one corrected him. Not Margaret, not Robert, and certainly not Victoria. They all just accepted his claim to belonging, his assertion of his place at their table, without question or protest. I wanted to scream, not out loud where everyone could hear me, but internally, where every fiber of my being was raging against this carefully orchestrated theater of civility. I wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge that this situation was uncomfortable, to ask if I was okay, or even just to offer a simple, Sorry, we didn't give you a heads up about this. But nothing came. No acknowledgement, no apology, no recognition that anything about this evening was unusual or potentially hurtful. Instead, Nathan looked at me directly for the first time since his arrival. It was just a brief glance, a single moment of eye contact, but it communicated everything I needed to know. He knew exactly what he was doing. That slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, that tiny, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. It wasn't innocent or accidental. It was territorial, a quiet but unmistakable declaration of dominance. I suddenly realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't just a casual visit or an unexpected social call. This was a deliberate statement, a calculated move designed to remind everyone at this table, including me, exactly where the real loyalties lay. Nathan wasn't here by accident. He was here to reclaim his position, to reassert his place in the family hierarchy that I had foolishly believed I might someday earn. I swallowed hard, the action requiring more effort than it should have, and pushed the food around on my plate with my fork. I nodded along mechanically when someone mentioned something about upcoming holiday plans, trying to maintain the facade of normalcy while my world crumbled around me. I smiled when prompted, applauded politely when Nathan made a cleverly timed joke, and played my assigned part as the obedient placeholder husband. Because that's exactly what I was in that moment, wasn't it? A temporary filler, a stand-in, a substitute actor holding down a role while the real star was away. I was the man Victoria had married while she waited for a reason not to regret letting Nathan go. And now that he was back, sitting at this table with the easy confidence of someone who had never really left, it was as if the entire room naturally tilted toward him like a plant reaching for sunlight. I looked at Victoria once, just once, hoping to catch some sign that she understood what this was doing to me. Her profile was perfect and serene, backlit by the warm glow of the chandelier overhead. She wasn't looking at Nathan in that particular moment, but she wasn't looking at me either. Her gaze was fixed somewhere in the middle distance, and that carefully neutral expression told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this situation. So I sat there in that elegant dining room, surrounded by the people who were supposed to be my family, not eating, not really speaking, just watching and breathing and trying to figure out when exactly the walls of my marriage had started crumbling around me. More importantly, I was trying to understand how I had failed to hear them falling, how I had missed all the warning signs that led to this moment of devastating clarity. By the time we reached the end of the meal, I couldn't remember what anyone had actually eaten. The specific dishes, the flavors, the careful presentation that Margaret took such pride in, all of it had faded into background noise. What I remembered with perfect, painful clarity was how it felt to sit at that table like I was attending someone else's family reunion, like I was the only person present who didn't understand that this wasn't my seat anymore. After the second toast celebrating Nathan's professional success, a toast that Robert delivered with genuine pride and enthusiasm, I realized I couldn't take another moment of this charade. My hand clenched around the base of my wine glass, gripping it hard enough that I worried for a second I might actually shatter it. I watched Nathan laugh easily with Robert, the two of them bonding like old war buddies sharing memories of battles fought and won. Victoria was chuckling softly beside Nathan, and Margaret was leaning in toward him as if he were the sun she wanted to orbit around. I sat at that table feeling completely invisible, a placeholder surrounded by people who had already decided where their true loyalty lay. They had made their choice without consulting me, without considering my feelings, without even acknowledging that I might have something to say about the situation. And I had finally reached my breaking point. I'd had enough of being treated like a piece of furniture that could be moved around or ignored at will. I pushed back my chair and stood up without saying a word, the legs scraping against the tile floor with a sound that was loud enough to make Margaret flinch visibly. Victoria looked up at me with an expression that seemed more startled than concerned, and if I'm being honest, there was a hint of annoyance in her eyes, as if I was somehow inconveniencing her by disrupting the flow of the evening. I didn't care about her reaction anymore. I had spent 4 years caring too much about everyone else's comfort while my own needs went completely unaddressed. I reached over and touched Victoria's elbow gently, my voice steady, but carrying an underlying coldness that I hadn't intended but couldn't suppress. "Can I talk to you for a second?" She glanced first at her mother, then at Nathan, as if she needed their permission or approval before she could have a private conversation with her own husband. After what felt like an eternity, she let out a sigh that made it clear she viewed my request as an unwelcome interruption to her evening. "Sure," she muttered, rising slowly from her chair like I was asking her to climb a mountain rather than step into the hallway. We moved into the dimly lit hallway where the light was softer and less harsh than the dining room's chandelier. The family photos that lined the walls seemed to glare down at me like silent judges, their frozen smiles mocking the tension that was building between us. Victoria folded her arms across her chest, her posture defensive and guarded, as if she was preparing for an attack rather than a conversation with her husband. "What is going on?" I asked, my voice maintaining its steady tone despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "Why is Nathan here? Why didn't you tell me he was coming?" Victoria rolled her eyes in a gesture that was both dismissive and infuriating, tilting her head as if I were being unreasonable for even asking these questions. "Trevor, it's not that deep," she said, with a casualness that felt like a slap across my face. "It's just Nathan. He's Margaret's guest tonight." "Margaret's guest?" I repeated, the words coming out with more force than I had intended. I was genuinely stunned by her attempt to minimize what I had just witnessed. "You hugged him like you hadn't seen him in years. You kissed his cheek right in front of me. You sat beside him at the dinner table and toasted his success like this was all perfectly normal behavior." She let out a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever, a sound that was sharp and cutting. "You're reading way too much into this, Trevor. You're making something out of nothing." I took a step back from her, feeling as if I'd been physically struck. The dismissiveness in her voice, the complete lack of acknowledgement of my feelings, the way she was gaslighting me into believing that my very reasonable concerns were somehow irrational. It all hit me at once like a wave of cold water. "I'm your husband," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've shown up to every single one of these family dinners for 4 years. I've smiled politely through the constant jabs and passive-aggressive comments. I've listened to the endless praise for a man who hasn't been part of this family for half a decade. And today, he walks in here like he owns the place, and you welcome him like you never really got over losing him." "He's just an ex," she snapped back, her patience clearly wearing thin. "You're embarrassing yourself with this jealousy." Those 4 words stopped everything for me. "You're embarrassing yourself." Not, "I'm sorry for not warning you." Not, "You're right. I should have considered your feelings." Not even, "Let me explain what's really going on here." Just complete dismissal of my legitimate concerns, wrapped up in an accusation that I was somehow the problem. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, as my jaw tightened and a lump formed in my throat that felt like it might choke me. The hallway suddenly felt colder, or maybe it was just me finally seeing the situation clearly for the first time. The woman I had married, the woman I had spent 4 years trying to build a life with, was standing in front of me treating my pain like an inconvenience. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" I whispered, my voice barely audible but heavy with the weight of my realization. "You kissed another man in front of your husband, and somehow I'm the one who's embarrassing himself?" She looked away from me, chewing the inside of her cheek in a nervous habit I'd seen countless times before. I waited, hoping against hope that she would say something to walk back her cruel words, something to acknowledge how deeply this whole evening had wounded me. I wanted her to realize that this wasn't about jealousy or insecurity. It was about basic respect and consideration for the person who was supposed to be her partner in life. But she didn't say anything. She just stood there with her arms crossed even tighter, as if she was physically shielding herself from having to deal with the consequences of her actions and her family's behavior. I turned and looked toward the dining room, where I could see Margaret watching our conversation from her seat at the table. She wore that smug, satisfied smirk that I had come to recognize as her signature expression whenever she managed to get her way. It was the look of someone who had orchestrated exactly this scenario and was pleased with how it was unfolding. Nathan had his wine glass halfway to his lips, his eyes cast downward as if he hadn't heard anything that had just transpired between Victoria and me in the hallway, but I knew he had heard every word. Of course he had. And then, standing there in that dimly lit hallway with family photos bearing witness to my humiliation, I finally saw it all with perfect clarity. I understood the choreography of control that had been playing out around me for months, maybe even years. I saw how effortlessly they had slipped Nathan back into his old place at the table, as if I had simply been holding that spot warm for him until he was ready to reclaim it. That dining room table, that carefully arranged family gathering, the entire social structure of this household, none of it had ever made room for me. They had simply paused their ongoing story when Nathan left, and now they were resuming it the exact second he walked back through their door. I was never meant to be a permanent addition to their family narrative. I was just a temporary placeholder, a brief intermission in the real story they wanted to tell. I turned back to Victoria, feeling a strange calm settle over me as everything finally made sense. "You don't even realize what you just showed me," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was finally understanding. She frowned, her expression genuinely confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, shaking my head slowly, "that I'm not actually the husband at that table. I'm just the man you settled for until your mother's favorite son came back into the picture." She blinked hard, as if my words had physically struck her. "That's not fair, Trevor." "No," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. "What's not fair is how long I tried to convince myself that I actually mattered in that room. What's not fair is how I spent 4 years bending over backward to earn a place at a table that was never meant for me." She opened her mouth to respond, probably to offer some weak justification or half-hearted apology, but I was already turning away from her. I didn't want to hear the excuses anymore. I didn't want to listen to the rationalizations or the too-late acknowledgments that would only make this whole situation more painful than it already was. I walked back down the hallway toward the dining room, my footsteps echoing in the silence that had settled over the house. I paused just before the entrance to the dining room, where the sound of clinking silverware and half-muffled laughter hit me like static electricity. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to decide whether I was about to make a scene that would give them all something to talk about for years to come, or whether I was going to walk away quietly and preserve whatever dignity I had left. Margaret raised her eyebrows expectantly when I reappeared in the doorway. "Everything all right?" she asked, with a tone that was far too sweet to be genuine, as if she were savoring the drama she had helped create. I didn't respond to her question. I didn't nod politely or force a smile like I had done countless times before. I didn't offer any of the usual pleasantries that had become my default response to uncomfortable situations in this house. Instead, I walked deliberately to my chair and slid it back into place with careful precision, the legs making a soft scraping sound against the tile floor. Victoria was just stepping back into the dining room behind me, her face flushed and her composure clearly shaken by our conversation in the hallway. The timing felt almost cinematic, as if the universe had orchestrated this moment for maximum impact. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my untouched plate, then stood up again, my movements deliberate and controlled. When I spoke, my voice was loud enough for everyone at the table to hear clearly, but it wasn't raised in anger or frustration. It was calm, measured, and final. "Thank you for showing me my place." The words hung in the air like a confession, an accusation, and a farewell, all wrapped into one simple sentence. Margaret's perpetual smirk faltered for the first time in the 4 years I'd known her. Robert looked up from his dessert with genuine confusion, as if he couldn't quite process what he had just heard. Nathan's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as he watched and waited to see what would happen next. And Victoria? She froze completely, her hands suspended above a wine glass, her eyes wide with the sudden realization that something irreversible had just occurred. No one spoke in the aftermath of my declaration. Not one person at that table asked me to stay or tried to smooth things over, or offered any kind of explanation or apology. I walked out of that dining room with the weight of their silence pressing against my back like a physical force. No one called after me as I made my way toward the front door. No one asked me to stay or tried to convince me that I was overreacting to the situation. The only sound that followed me was the steady, deliberate click of my shoes against the tile floor, the footsteps of a man who had finally seen the truth about his place in this family, and who had found the courage to stop pretending that table had ever truly been his. But something unexpected happened as I reached the front door. Instead of leaving immediately, I found myself turning around and walking back toward the dining room. There was a quiet resolve settling over me, something I had never felt before in all my years of attending these family gatherings. The echoes of my own footsteps were still ringing in the hallway, but now they carried a different energy entirely. When I appeared in the dining room doorway for the second time that evening, every face turned toward me with a kind of clarity flickering in their eyes, like a lamp that had suddenly been switched on in a dark room. Margaret's perfect posture wavered slightly, as if she sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamic she was so accustomed to controlling. Robert straightened his back as if he were bracing himself for some kind of impact. Victoria hesitated mid-step, her hand hovering uncertainly above a wine glass, clearly unsure of what was coming next. Nathan paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, his eyebrows arched in what looked like professional curiosity, as if he were studying an interesting case study rather than witnessing a man's marriage fall apart in real time. I stood at the edge of that ornate dining table, with its centerpiece of carefully arranged roses and flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The whole scene looked so innocent and peaceful, like a Norman Rockwell painting of family togetherness. I reached for my napkin, which was still folded beside my plate, and set it on the polished wood surface with deliberate precision. The crease in the fabric was exact, intentional, a silent punctuation mark for what I was about to say. I pulled my chair back with controlled strength, letting it slide forward just enough to make a soft, whispering sound against the floor, then released it. The movement was small but somehow significant, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room tracking the motion. I let the moment stretch out, allowing the silence to build until the tension was almost palpable, making sure that everyone present could feel the weight of my stillness and understand that something important was happening. My hands pressed lightly against the back of the chair as I stood there, looking around at the faces that had become so familiar over the past 4 years. My plate sat before me, a carefully arranged collection of roast beef and green beans that had long since grown cold. I hadn't taken more than a few bites all evening, but I could taste something else in the air instead, the sharp, metallic tang of unspoken apologies and shifting allegiances. The room felt smaller somehow, as if my newfound conviction had somehow pulled the walls inward, creating an intimate space where truth could finally be spoken. I didn't rush into words immediately. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath, inhaling the familiar scents of rosemary from dinner and the faded cloth napkins that Margaret had used for years. I counted the seconds as they crawled by, ensuring that everyone in that room could feel the full weight of my presence and my resolve. I straightened my shoulders and looked directly at Margaret first. She wore the slightest tightening around her mouth, not anger exactly because her face was too well trained and practiced for such obvious displays of emotion, but rather the dawning realization that her carefully maintained authority had slipped, if only by a fraction. Then I turned my attention to Robert, whose eyes were searching my face as though he were trying to recognize the man who had suddenly reclaimed himself from years of quiet compliance. There was confusion there, but also something that might have been respect, as if he were finally seeing me as a person rather than as a convenient accessory to his daughter's life. Next, I looked at Victoria and I saw fear flickering in her expression. Fear that she had miscalculated something important, that she had pushed too far or stayed silent too long. It was the look of someone who was just beginning to understand that actions have consequences, and that those consequences can't always be managed or controlled. Finally, my gaze settled on Nathan, whose carefully composed mask had developed the smallest crack for the first time since he'd walked through the door. I saw my entire life reflected in their faces. All the compromises I had made, all the words I had swallowed, all the dinners I had endured with a polite smile that masked the storm building inside me. I resisted the overwhelming urge to remind them aloud of every single sacrifice I had made over the years. I wanted to list every afternoon I had spent arranging floral centerpieces for their charity events. Every evening I had volunteered at the fundraising drives that they constantly praised Nathan for organizing. Every countless time I had held my tongue while Margaret recounted holiday memories that starred him as the perfect son-in-law. All those victories, all those moments of family connection and community service, they belonged to Nathan in their collective memory. He was their favorite son, their ideal standard, the measuring stick against which all other men would forever fall short. I had been reduced to their polite footnote, a minor character in the margins of their family story. While Nathan occupied the starring role in every anecdote and fond remembrance, I was barely worth mentioning when they recounted the significant events and relationships in Victoria's life. Taking a steady, centering breath, I spoke with a voice that was calm but carried the weight of absolute resolution. Thank you for showing me my place. My words filled the room completely, gentle in tone, but undeniable in their finality. The syllables hung in the air between us like an unspoken allegation and a definitive farewell all wrapped into one simple statement. I paused deliberately, letting the meaning sink into each person at that table, watching as the implications of what I had said began to register on their faces. The quiet murmur of silverware against fine china ceased entirely. Even the low, steady hum of the chandelier seemed to grow muted in the aftermath of my declaration. Victoria's eyes glistened with the first hint of unshed tears, and she opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, swallowing whatever words had been forming. It was clear that she was struggling with wordless regret, but equally clear that she didn't know how to express it, or even if she truly felt it. Margaret's lips pressed together into a thin, straight line, and her eyes flicked away from mine, unable to maintain eye contact. It was the first time I had ever seen her look genuinely uncomfortable in her own dining room. Robert shifted restlessly in his seat, blinking repeatedly as though he were uncertain which version of reality was true. The one where he had spent years dismissing and correcting me, or the one where he had been celebrating and welcoming Nathan. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since his arrival, that easy charm that he wore like armor was stripped away completely. What remained was the hollow certainty of a man who had guided himself back to this house, knowing exactly what kind of damage his presence would cause, and who was now facing the consequences of that calculated decision. I stepped back from the table, released my grip on the chair, and felt the floor settle solidly beneath my feet. The sensation was grounding, real, substantial, in a way that nothing in this house had felt for years. I didn't wait for a protest that I knew wouldn't come. I didn't pause for an apology that was clearly never going to be offered. I didn't hold out hope for a plea that might convince me to stay and continue playing the role of the accommodating husband. I could see in their collective stillness that each person at that table had chosen silence over sentiment. They were comfortable with a routine that included Nathan's triumphant return, but explicitly excluded my meaningful presence. They had rehearsed every reaction to his homecoming, every embrace and welcome and toast, but they had never once considered the possibility that I would finally reclaim control of my own narrative. I turned to look at Victoria one final time. She was my wife, at least for now, and I wanted to give her one last opportunity to say something that might change the trajectory of this moment. My expression wasn't angry or pleading. It was simply resolute. The face of a man who had finally found his backbone after years of bending it to accommodate other people's comfort. I saw so much in her expression as she looked back at me. There was surprise, certainly, and regret, and confusion about how things had reached this point so quickly. Perhaps there was even genuine sorrow for the pain she had caused. But what I didn't see, what was glaringly, devastatingly absent, was regret powerful enough to make her want to change the evening's script. Her loyalty clearly lay elsewhere, with the family that continued to step around me and over me in order to accommodate someone they valued infinitely more than they had ever valued me. I pushed the front door open, and the cool night air from outside rushed into the house, carrying with it the faint, sweet fragrance of lavender from Margaret's meticulously maintained garden. The scent felt like a blessing, like nature itself was offering me a fresh start and a new beginning. It was a boundary drawn not in words or arguments, but in the very air I was breathing, a clear division between the life I was leaving behind and the unknown path that lay ahead of me. I paused there on the threshold, one foot planted firmly on the porch and one foot still inside the house that had never truly felt like home. The symbolic weight of this position wasn't lost on me. I was literally standing between two worlds, between the version of myself that had tolerated being merely tolerated and the man I was choosing to become. The house behind me fell into a silence so complete it felt almost sacred, as though the entire structure was holding its breath and waiting for me to make my final decision. Would I retreat back into the familiar comfort of compromise and accommodation, Or would I have the courage to walk away from everything I had known for the past 4 years and forge a new path entirely on my own terms? My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears, but my mind had achieved a clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about running away from pain or escaping from an uncomfortable situation. This was about finally choosing myself, about refusing to accept a version of love that required me to diminish my own worth and value as a human being. It was time to leave behind the version of myself that had spent years tolerating being merely tolerated. It was time to embrace the man who demanded to be seen, respected, and valued for who he truly was. I closed the door behind me with a firm, decisive click that seemed to echo through the empty hallway like a gunshot. The sound reverberated down the corridor, serving as audible proof that I had chosen this moment, that I had taken control of my own destiny rather than continuing to let others dictate the terms of my existence. I did not look back over my shoulder to see if anyone would follow me out of the house. I knew with absolute certainty that they would not. There would be no dramatic chase scene, no frantic search, no last-minute plea for me to reconsider my decision. They had made their choice the moment they welcomed Nathan back into their circle and treated me like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Outside, the driveway shimmered under the soft, golden glow of the carefully placed garden lamps that lined the walkway. I stood there for a long moment, letting the night air brush against my face like a gentle caress. Stars were beginning to peek through the velvet darkness of the sky above me, tiny points of light that seemed to promise infinite possibilities waiting to be discovered. I drew in a long, liberating breath, filling my lungs completely with the cool night air and the intoxicating sense of freedom that came with it. Behind me, the house remained silent and still, its windows glowing warmly, but somehow seeming cold and unwelcoming now that I was seeing it from the outside. Those rooms held memories of dinners endured, grudges nursed, and resentments that had festered for years without ever being properly addressed. But ahead of me lay the road I had traveled once before. Alone, uncertain about what the future might hold, but finally, blissfully free from the suffocating expectations and constant disappointments that had defined my life for so long. I lifted my head high and squared my shoulders with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. Then I took a deliberate step forward, away from the front porch and toward my car parked in the circular driveway. Each stride carried me further from the man who had once sat politely at that dining room table, swallowing his pride and his hopes in equal measure, week after week, month after month. Each step echoed a promise that I was making to myself, that I would never again settle for a seat at any table that wasn't meant for me, that I would never again compromise my self-worth for the sake of keeping peace with people who didn't value my presence. The night seemed to envelop me in its protective darkness, and with every passing moment, I felt lighter and stronger and more alive than I had in years. I was alive in a way that I hadn't even realized was possible, until I found the courage to walk away from a situation that was slowly killing my spirit. Behind me, the house remained exactly as I had left it, silent and still, its doors closed, its family unchanged by my departure. Margaret would still be sitting at the head of her perfectly set table, Robert would still be making his cutting remarks, Nathan would still be charming everyone with his easy confidence, and Victoria would still be choosing their approval over her husband's dignity. But I was changed, fundamentally and irrevocably transformed by the decision I had just made. As I disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the garden lamps, I knew with absolute certainty that I had left behind the version of myself that had spent years tolerating being merely tolerated. In its place, I had embraced the man who had finally found the courage to demand that he be seen, respected, and valued for exactly who he was. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I slipped out of a modest motel's creaky door just past dawn, moving quietly so as not to disturb any other guests who might still be sleeping. I settled into the driver's seat of my car as if I were assuming a disguise, transforming myself from Trevor Blake, the accommodating son-in-law, into Trevor Blake, the man who had finally learned where he didn't belong and now needed to discover where he actually did. The engine hummed beneath me with a gentle, insistent sound that seemed to be urging me onward, encouraging me to leave the past behind and embrace whatever lay ahead. I pulled away from the motel's parking lot without any specific destination in mind, letting the tires carry me forward onto a silent highway that was painted gold by the rising sun. The dashboard glowed softly in the early morning light, and I felt like I was leaving behind not just a building or a town, but an entire world that had never truly been mine. I drove without turning on the radio, without making any phone calls, without any music to distract me from the thoughts that were rattling through my mind like stones in a jar. There was just the steady hum of the road beneath my wheels and the rhythmic beat of my own heart, which seemed to be pumping with renewed strength and purpose. For the first time in years, I had no schedule to keep, no obligations to fulfill, no family dinners to attend where I would be expected to smile politely while being systematically diminished. I had only the open road stretching endlessly before me and my own fractured but slowly healing resolve to guide me forward. As the miles slipped by under the ribbon of asphalt, the silence in the car felt sharp against my eardrums, like a question that had lodged itself in my chest and refused to be ignored. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tightly at each gentle curve in the road, surprised by the tremor in my hands that I hadn't expected to feel. Each rotation of the wheels seemed to shed another layer of the doubt that had accumulated over the years. Doubt that I belonged in that dining room. Doubt that I was good enough for a family who had never truly wanted me. Doubt that Victoria actually saw me as anything more than a convenient placeholder. With no radio playing to fill the empty space in the car, my thoughts echoed and bounced around the interior like ricocheting bullets. I realized that I had never really allowed myself to feel this raw, unfiltered combination of fear and relief that was now coursing through my veins. For so long, I had been focused on managing other people's emotions and reactions that I had forgotten what my own feelings actually sounded like when they weren't being filtered through the need to keep everyone else comfortable. The fear was real and sharp, the terror of starting over, of being alone, of not knowing what came next. But underneath that fear was something else, something that felt almost foreign after years of suppression. Relief. Relief at finally escaping the polite cruelty that had become the background soundtrack of my life. Relief at no longer having to force smiles at family gatherings where I was treated like an unwelcome intruder. Relief at never again having to endure those endless reminders that I would never measure up to the ghost of Nathan Penn. I passed a billboard advertising a roadside diner, its stark red sign promising home-cooked meals and the kind of simple comfort that you could only find in places where nobody knew your story. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to pull off the highway and seek refuge in someone else's kitchen, to look for acceptance and belonging in yet another place where I would be just another customer rather than a valued member of a community. But I resisted that impulse, recognizing it as part of the same pattern that had kept me trapped for so long, always searching for comfort and validation from external sources, always hoping that the next meal or the next conversation would somehow fill the hole that could only be filled from within. Comfort had been nothing more than an illusion at the Blake family table, a mirage that kept me coming back week after week, hoping that this time would be different. So I let the diner's red sign fade behind me in the rearview mirror, consumed by sunlight and distance. Instead of seeking refuge in familiar patterns, I focused my attention on the horizon ahead, where the sky and earth blended together into a pale promise of new beginnings and fresh possibilities. The radio remained silent throughout my journey, and I felt that absence of sound begin to reshape me like cold water splashing against stone, slowly carving something truer and harder in its relentless path. The voices of the past, the taunts, the dismissive laughter, the piercing toast to Nathan's continued success, no longer had any purchase or power over me in this quiet space. They had been replaced by something far more valuable: the steady hum of my tires against asphalt and the pulse of my own determination beating strong and sure in my chest. My thoughts drifted inevitably to the apartment that Victoria and I had shared, to the wedding ring I had deliberately left behind on the dresser like a discarded artifact from a life that no longer fit me. I imagined walking back into those familiar rooms and picking up the framed photograph that I had turned face down on the coffee table weeks ago, flipping it over to see my own reflection staring back at me. A stranger with deep shadows under his eyes. A man who had somehow forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely respected and valued. I thought about the empty picture frames that were scattered throughout our living room. Frames that had been meant to hold images of our shared happiness, but had instead become echoes of a story that had ended before it could truly begin. The sight of myself smiling in those photographs, surrounded by faces that I had mistakenly believed were welcoming me into their family, had grown too heavy and painful to carry. The image of me trying so desperately to fit into a narrative that had never been written with me in mind had become unbearable to look at. But here, in the solitude of this endless highway, each mile that passed beneath my wheels seemed to wash away another fragment of that accumulated weight. The burden of trying to be someone else's version of acceptable was lifting from my shoulders like morning mist, evaporating in the warmth of the rising sun. All that remained now was an empty canvas and a pen poised to write the next chapter of my life. A chapter that would be entirely my own creation. A gentle breeze wafted through the slightly cracked window of my car, carrying with it the clean scents of pine trees and wild grass that grew untamed along the roadside. I breathed in that fresh air deeply, as if I were inhaling permission to exist outside the narrow confines and suffocating expectations that others had constructed around me for so long. My shoulders gradually unclenched from the defensive position they had held for years, and I felt the tight knot of anxiety in my chest begin to loosen and dissolve. I found myself slowing the car as I passed under a magnificent stand of towering oak trees, their branches creating a natural cathedral above the road. Sunlight filtered down through the canopy of leaves like golden confetti, dancing in the warm breeze, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted and changed with each passing moment. I actually closed my eyes for a brief moment, despite being behind the wheel, just long enough to let that warmth slide across my face like a blessing. In that hushed, sacred moment beneath the oaks, I made a silent but powerful vow to myself. I would never again allow myself to be diminished or reduced to less than I truly was. I would actively seek out people who genuinely saw me for who I was, who heard and valued what I had to say, who appreciated my presence rather than merely tolerating it as an inconvenience they had to endure. I would find my way to a table where my voice carried actual weight and meaning, where my stories were honored and respected, where my laughter was welcomed and encouraged rather than politely ignored. I would build a life surrounded by people who chose to include me not out of obligation or social convention, but because they genuinely wanted me to be part of their world. Several hours later, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and warmed the dashboard until the interior of the car smelled of hot vinyl and unlimited possibility, I glanced up at the bright blue expanse above me through the windshield. I realized with a start that I had crossed into towns whose names I had never heard before, places I could barely pronounce, each one representing a potential fresh start that was further and further removed from the life I had known and the pain I had endured. The empty road continued to stretch before me like a ribbon of pure freedom, and I began to understand that this drive, this journey with no predetermined destination, was much more than just an escape from an impossible situation. It was a pilgrimage back to myself, a return to the man I had been before I started trying so desperately to fit into spaces that were never meant to accommodate me. I turned the steering wheel gently toward the rising sun, consciously choosing to drive toward the light rather than away from it. With each mile that passed, I was leaving behind the ghost of a husband who had sat in silent resignation at a dinner table that had never truly belonged to him. Ahead of me lay uncharted roads and unspoken truths, territories I had never explored because I had been too busy trying to fit into someone else's predetermined map of how my life should unfold. For the first time in years, I was facing these unknown possibilities willingly, with curiosity rather than fear. The first night without Victoria was quieter than I had expected it would be. I checked into a modest motel just off the main highway, the kind of unpretentious place with faded floral quilts, uneven wooden floorboards that creaked with each step, and a handwritten welcome sign posted by the front desk that had clearly been there for years. There were no grand gestures here, no attempts at luxury or sophistication, just a simple room, a heavy metal key, and a door that closed behind me with a solid, reassuring click that seemed to seal off the world I had left behind. I stood in the exact center of that unremarkable room for what felt like an eternity, not moving, barely breathing, just existing in the profound silence that surrounded and filled me. This wasn't just the absence of sound from the external world. It was a deep, internal quiet that seemed to stretch out inside me like a vast, empty plain. There was no television humming in the background, no familiar sound of Victoria brushing her teeth in the bathroom while humming fragments of songs she never quite finished, no late-night phone calls from her mother with reminders about upcoming brunches or dinner plans or social obligations. Just me, alone with my thoughts for the first time in what felt like decades. And remarkably, For the first time in years, I didn't feel the compulsive need to fill that silence with activity or distraction or noise of any kind. I dropped my hastily packed travel bag by the foot of the narrow bed and sat down heavily, the old mattress creaking and groaning beneath my weight in a way that was somehow comforting rather than annoying. There was a mirror mounted on the wall across from me, positioned above a small, scratched wooden desk, and I caught an unexpected glimpse of myself in its reflection. My shirt was wrinkled and rumpled from hours of driving. My eyes looked tired and slightly glassy, and there was a faint shadow of stubble on my jaw that I hadn't bothered to shave that morning. But as I studied that reflection more carefully, something struck me as significant. The man staring back at me from that cheap motel mirror didn't look broken or defeated, despite everything he had been through. He looked still, centered, present in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. There was a calmness in his expression that I hadn't seen in years. I rose from the bed and walked slowly across the worn carpet to stand directly in front of the mirror, positioning myself so that the pale yellow light from the bedside lamp created a soft circle of illumination behind me. I studied myself like I was meeting a stranger for the first time, taking inventory of features I had stopped really seeing years ago. I noticed the slight arch of my eyebrows when I was concentrating, the way I unconsciously clenched my jaw when I was trying not to feel too much, the gradual slope of my shoulders that had developed over years of carrying burdens I wasn't even aware I had been carrying. And yet, beneath all the obvious signs of fatigue and stress, there was something else that I was just beginning to recognize. It was clarity, a sharp, clean understanding of who I was and what I needed that had been buried under years of compromise and accommodation. I wasn't the broken man I'd expected to see in that mirror. I was simply a man who had finally stopped pretending that he belonged somewhere he didn't. I didn't cry that night, and I didn't rage against the unfairness of my situation. There was no dramatic emotional breakdown, no cinematic moment of cathartic release. Instead, there was just a profound stillness that I hadn't allowed myself to experience in years. A deep quiet that felt like coming home to myself after a very long journey in foreign territory. I placed both palms flat against the surface of the small desk and leaned forward, staring deeply into my own eyes as if I could somehow pull the answers I needed directly from my reflection. What did I actually want from my life? Not just from Victoria or from her family, but from myself. From the man I was in the process of becoming. From the future I was now free to create entirely on my own terms. The moment I walked away from that family table, I had crossed a threshold into unknown territory, and now I needed to figure out how to navigate this new landscape I found myself in. My phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand beside the bed, and I didn't even need to look at the screen to know who was calling. I could feel Victoria's presence emanating from that small device like heat from a flame, her desperation and confusion reaching across the miles to find me in this anonymous motel room. I walked over to the phone and glanced at the caller ID display, confirming what I already knew. Victoria's name appeared in bold letters, accompanied by the familiar photograph I had taken of her laughing in our kitchen on what now seemed like a lifetime ago. One missed call quickly became 2, then 3, then 4. By the time I sat back down on the edge of the bed, the missed call count had climbed steadily higher, each unanswered ring representing another attempt to pull me back into a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I let the phone continue to ring, not because I wanted to punish Victoria or make her suffer, but because for the first time in 4 years, I needed to hear the sound of my own thoughts without her voice blurring the edges of my understanding. I needed to sit with my own emotions and reactions without immediately having to process and manage hers as well. I found myself thinking about the way Victoria had looked at Nathan during dinner, not with romantic longing or obvious attraction, but with something that was perhaps even more threatening to our marriage: familiarity. She had looked at him like he was something known and safe, something that didn't need to be questioned or defended or explained. She had never once looked at me that way, not in all our years together. I had always been her new chapter, the fresh start after things hadn't worked out the first time around, but I was never the favorite passage in the book of her life. I was the man she had chosen to marry after her real love story had ended, the reliable second choice who could provide stability and commitment, even if he couldn't provide the same level of excitement or passion. I was the clean slate she had turned to after the storm of her relationship with Nathan had passed, but I was beginning to understand that she had never stopped missing the thunder and lightning that he had brought to her world. My phone buzzed again, this time with the distinctive sound that indicated a voicemail had been left. Then another voicemail, and another. I could imagine Victoria sitting in our apartment, probably in the same chair where she liked to read on Sunday mornings, calling me over and over again with increasing desperation as she realized that I wasn't going to pick up the phone and make this easy for her. But I didn't listen to those messages, and I didn't delete them either. I simply sat in that modest motel room, wrapped in the kind of profound quiet that felt like a direct line to truth itself. The air in the room was cool and clean, and I pulled the faded floral quilt over my shoulders, still fully dressed because I was too emotionally and physically exhausted to even consider changing clothes. My entire body ached, not from any physical exertion, but from years of walking emotional tightropes that I had constructed for people who barely noticed whether I managed to keep my balance or fell to the ground below them. Every muscle in my shoulders and back carried the tension of countless dinner conversations where I had bitten my tongue, countless social gatherings where I had smiled politely while being systematically ignored or dismissed. I closed my eyes and expected the full weight of everything that had happened to come crashing down on me like an avalanche of grief and regret and uncertainty about the future. I braced myself for the emotional breakdown that surely had to be coming, the tears and anger and desperate second-guessing that would be the natural response to walking away from a 4-year marriage. But instead of devastation, something strange and entirely unexpected settled over me like a warm blanket. It wasn't dramatic or euphoric, just a soft, steady awareness that felt almost revolutionary in its simplicity. I didn't have to keep trying to prove myself worthy of love and acceptance to people who had already decided that I would never quite measure up to their standards. The world didn't need my perfection or my endless accommodation. It needed my authentic presence, and tonight I had finally chosen to give that gift to myself. Sometime well past midnight, I woke up feeling incredibly thirsty, my mouth dry as cotton from the emotional exhaustion of the day. I wandered slowly to the small bathroom, my bare feet silent against the cool tile floor. The overhead light was harsh and unforgiving, reflecting off the white surfaces and creating sharp shadows that made everything look stark and clinical. I turned the faucet handle and cupped the cool, refreshing water in my palms, bringing it to my mouth and letting it soothe the dryness in my throat. As I drank, I glanced up at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror above the sink. It was the same face I had been studying earlier, the same tired eyes and day-old stubble, but something fundamental had shifted in my expression. There was a resolve there now that hadn't existed just hours before. Where there had once been only compliance and the desperate desire to please others at any cost, I could now see the emergence of something much stronger and more authentic. I was looking at a man who was finally learning to respect himself, to value his own needs and desires as much as he had always valued everyone else's. I stared at that reflection for a long moment, taking in the subtle but significant changes that had occurred in just one day of choosing myself over the comfort of others. Then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, just one, a private agreement between me and the man I was finally beginning to become. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of independence all wrapped up in that single gesture. Back in the narrow motel bed, I lay on my back staring up at the water-stained ceiling tiles, listening to the familiar sounds of the night world outside my window. The building creaked and settled around me with the gentle noises that old structures make as they adjust to changes in temperature and humidity. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the occasional whoosh of a car passing on the highway, and even further away, the lonesome call of a nightbird echoing through the darkness. My phone buzzed yet again from its position on the nightstand, the screen lighting up briefly before going dark again. I could see Victoria's name appear in the notification, another missed call to add to the growing collection that I had no intention of returning tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either. Maybe not ever if I was being completely honest with myself about the direction my life was heading. I reached over without looking and turned the phone face down against the wooden surface of the nightstand. I didn't want to see her words. Didn't want to read her attempts to explain or justify or minimize what had happened at her parents' house. Not yet. And possibly not at all. Because this night, this very first night of my new life, belonged entirely to me. This was my first night without Victoria sleeping beside me, without the familiar pull of marital obligation dictating my responses and reactions. This was my first night without the soft armor of denial that I had wrapped around myself for so many years, protecting me from the harsh reality of my situation, while simultaneously preventing me from taking any meaningful action to change it. Tonight, I had something infinitely more valuable than answers to all the questions that were swirling around in my mind. I had my own voice, clear and strong and uninfluenced by anyone else's expectations or demands. I had my own silence, profound and healing and entirely under my control. I had my own space, both physical and emotional, where I could simply exist without having to perform or pretend or apologize for taking up room in the world. The window beside my bed was cracked open, just enough to let in a gentle breath of wind from the trees that surrounded the motel property. The night breeze rustled the thin curtains softly, creating a barely audible whisper that sounded almost like nature itself was affirming the choice I had made. It was a sound of approval, of encouragement, of welcome into a world where I could finally be authentic without fear of judgment or rejection. I closed my eyes and pulled the faded quilt up to my chest, settling deeper into the mattress as I listened to the quiet rhythm of the world outside my temporary sanctuary. There was the gentle creak of tree branches swaying in the wind, the distant call of that night bird I had heard earlier, and underneath it all, the steady sound of my own breathing, calm, regular, unforced. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring to my doorstep, didn't have any clear vision of what my life would look like a week or a month or a year from now. But tonight, in this moment, I didn't have to perform for anyone's approval. I didn't have to beg for acceptance or recognition. I didn't have to pretend that I was satisfied with less than I deserved. Tonight, I just had to be exactly who I was. And for the first time in years, that felt like more than enough. By the time the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the cracks in the motel room's Venetian blinds, painting thin golden lines across the worn carpet, my phone had accumulated an staggering 67 missed calls and at least a dozen voicemails. Each notification that appeared on the screen felt like a pulse demanding my immediate attention, a digital heartbeat that was desperately trying to pull at the edges of my newfound resolve and drag me back into the chaos I had walked away from. I lay motionless between the plain white sheets of the motel's narrow bed, my mind caught in that strange liminal space between exhaustion and hyper-alertness that comes from processing major life changes. I was simultaneously too drained to surrender to sleep and too wired with adrenaline and revelation to find any real rest. The emotional weight of the previous evening was still settling into my bones, but there was also an electric current of possibility running through my veins that made it impossible to completely relax. My finger hovered uncertainly above the phone's screen, trembling slightly as I debated whether to swipe away all those urgent notifications or to finally engage with the storm of messages that Victoria had been sending throughout the night. Each buzz of the phone, each appearance of her name on the caller ID, felt like a lifeline being thrown by someone who was drowning. But I was beginning to realize that the person who was really drowning was me, and I needed to save myself before I could even think about helping anyone else. I wasn't ready to hear Victoria's voice yet, wasn't prepared to listen to what I knew would be a mixture of pleading and defensiveness, explanations and justifications that would try to minimize the significance of what had happened at her parents' house. Not yet, and maybe not ever, because every missed call and unread voicemail was a reminder of the confidence she had misplaced and the trust she had shattered through her silence and complicity. Hours earlier, as I had lain in the same bed listening to the phone ring incessantly, I had made the conscious decision to let those calls accumulate like fallen leaves. Each ring had been a test of my commitment to putting my own emotional well-being first, and each time I had chosen not to answer, I had proven to myself that I was finally strong enough to resist the gravitational pull of other people's emergencies and demands. "Trevor, please call me back," her voice had pleaded through the small speaker during one of the few messages I had accidentally overheard. "We need to talk about this. Don't do anything rash. I can explain everything. I'm standing outside your apartment door right now, and I don't understand why you're not here." Each message had been another lifeline thrown across the emotional chasm that had opened between us, cast by someone who refused to understand that I wasn't drowning in confusion or anger. I was drowning in the suffocating realization that my marriage had been built on a foundation of tolerance rather than genuine love and respect. I finally forced myself to get out of bed, my legs feeling stiff and unsteady from the emotional marathon of the previous day. I dressed mechanically in the same clothes I had worn when I walked out of that house, my shirt still carrying the creases and wrinkles from yesterday's tension, my jeans worn soft from hours of driving through unfamiliar territory, and my shoes still carrying traces of gravel dust from the lake dock where I'd stopped to think during my aimless journey. Looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I felt like a ghost inhabiting the skin of a man I used to know, but no longer recognized. The person staring back at me had the same basic features, the same bone structure and coloring, but there was something fundamentally different about his expression, something that spoke of boundaries established and self-respect reclaimed. I sat down heavily at the small wooden desk beneath the window and stared at the glowing screen of my phone, watching Victoria's name flash repeatedly at the top of my notifications list. Each message was a reminder of the relationship I had tried so desperately to salvage, the confidence I had invested so unwisely, and the trust that had been systematically eroded over months and years of small betrayals and casual dismissals. My thumb moved hesitantly toward the first voicemail in the queue, but then I stopped myself. I realized that I wasn't ready to hear her voice yet, wasn't prepared to be pulled back into the emotional undertow of her explanations and justifications. Her voice would be soft and pleading, designed to make me feel guilty for causing her distress, calculated to make me forget that I had every right to be hurt and angry about what had transpired. Instead of listening to her messages, I made a different choice. I highlighted all 67 missed calls and deleted them in a single, decisive gesture, watching as Victoria's desperate attempts to reach me vanished from my phone's memory like smoke dissipating in the wind. Along with those calls went the 50 voicemails that had accumulated throughout the night, each one representing another attempt to drag me back into a dynamic that had been slowly killing my spirit for years. The air in the motel room felt suddenly thick and saturated with the weight of regret and possibility, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath while I made decisions that would determine the entire trajectory of my future. I closed the phone with a decisive snap and stood up from the desk, padding barefoot across the worn carpet to the window overlooking the parking lot below. The early morning scene outside was one of transition and movement. Guests were checking out of their rooms, rolling their suitcases over the cracked asphalt with the purposeful efficiency of people who had places to go and lives to resume. Car engines fired up with mechanical reliability, doors clicked shut with finality, and the ordinary business of life continued to move forward around me while I remained suspended in this moment of profound personal transformation. Life outside this room was progressing at its normal pace, while inside, I felt like I had been standing completely still, tethered to memories and obligations that no longer served any constructive purpose in my life. I was anchored to the past by a wedding ring that I had abandoned on a dresser and a collection of shared experiences that had left me feeling more isolated than if I had been completely alone. But standing at that window, watching strangers navigate their own journeys with confidence and purpose, I realized that I didn't have to remain frozen in this liminal space between my old life and whatever came next. I had autonomy that I had never fully claimed before, a freedom that had been born from my refusal to accept a version of myself that bent and twisted to accommodate everyone else's comfort and convenience. I left the voicemails unanswered, a decision that felt both liberating and terrifying in its finality. I left Victoria's increasingly desperate text messages unread, refusing to be drawn back into the emotional chaos that she was trying to create around my absence. I left the door to my motel room cracked open just slightly, allowing a thin line of pale morning light to cut across the dark carpet like a promise of new possibilities waiting to be explored. The gentle creak of the door hinges was soft and barely audible, but even that small sound reminded me that I didn't have to stay trapped in this room, in this town, or in this emotional state. I had choices to make and a future to create, and for the first time in years, those choices were entirely my own to make. I grabbed my jacket from the chair where I had thrown it the night before and stepped into the corridor outside my room. The beige walls were familiar yet somehow foreign, as if I were seeing them through completely different eyes than the man who had walked these same hallways just hours earlier. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, creating a hollow sound that made me feel like I was the first guest to traverse these halls at dawn, a pioneer exploring uncharted territory. The motel's front desk was completely deserted when I reached the lobby, with only a solitary lamp glowing in the corner to provide any illumination in the dim space. The night clerk had apparently gone off duty, leaving behind an atmosphere of quiet abandonment that somehow felt appropriate for this moment of transition in my life. I approached the vacant counter and left a crisp $20 bill beside the guest register, along with my room key. I didn't need to interact with anyone or explain my early departure. I simply signed my name in the ledger with a pencil that had been left beside the book, the graphite scratching against the paper in sharp, decisive strokes that felt like I was signing a Declaration of Independence. I pushed through the glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the cool morning air, letting it wash over me in long, purposeful breaths that seemed to cleanse my lungs of the stale atmosphere of compromise and accommodation that I had been breathing for far too long. The parking lot was nearly empty now, with only a few cars remaining from the previous night's occupants, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves in the trees that bordered the property. Back in my car, I slid into the driver's seat and glanced at the dashboard clock, which read 7:14 a.m. in glowing green digits. My phone remained switched off and buried deep in my jacket pocket, where it couldn't intrude on this moment of clarity with its insistent demands for my attention. I didn't need its constant reminders of the life I was leaving behind, or the people who were trying to pull me back into patterns that had never truly served my best interests. The road was calling to me again, that familiar ribbon of asphalt stretching endlessly beneath an open sky that promised freedom and possibility in equal measure. With a simple turn of the key, my engine hummed to life, and I felt the subtle vibration of potential energy waiting to be released. I shifted into drive and moved forward, leaving the motel and all of its temporary ghosts behind me like shadows that had no power in the light of day. The drive that second day carried a completely different energy than my desperate flight from Victoria's parents' house the night before. The urgent need to escape had transformed into something much quieter and more purposeful, a sense of deliberation that came from having survived the initial shock of my decision and emerged on the other side with my resolve intact. I drove through small towns with shuttered storefronts and over bridges that arched gracefully above slow-moving rivers, taking in the landscape with eyes that were finally clear of the fog of denial and false hope that had clouded my vision for so long. At each red light, I found myself studying my reflection in the rearview mirror, noting how the eyes looking back at me seemed clearer now, more focused and alert than they had been in years. The chronic tension that had been etched around my jaw like a permanent mask was beginning to soften in the morning light, and I could see the emergence of something that had been buried for far too long: genuine self-respect. I allowed myself to imagine a completely new routine, one where I answered only to the rhythm of my own heartbeat rather than to the constant barrage of text messages that began with phrases like, "You're overreacting," or "Don't let one dinner ruin everything we've built together." I pictured mornings where I could wake up naturally, without the immediate anxiety of wondering whether I had disappointed someone or failed to meet some unspoken expectation that had been set without my knowledge or consent. By late afternoon, when hunger finally nudged me towards civilization, I spotted a roadside cafe with a faded, hand-painted sign that promised soup and sandwiches with the kind of simple honesty that felt like a balm to my soul. I turned into the gravel parking lot without any guilt or second-guessing, making the decision based purely on what I wanted, rather than what I thought others might expect or approve of. The waitress who greeted me had kind eyes and a genuine smile, and she poured coffee into my cup before I had even settled into the worn vinyl booth. There was something refreshing about this simple interaction with a stranger who had no preconceived notions about who I should be or how I should behave. She didn't know my history, didn't have any investment in my choices, and didn't expect me to be anyone other than exactly who I was in that moment. I ordered a turkey club sandwich and watched the steam rise from my coffee cup like incense, carrying with it all the accumulated stress and anxiety of the past several years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was making decisions based entirely on my own preferences and desires, without having to factor in anyone else's opinions or potential reactions. I took my time with the sandwich, letting each bite anchor me firmly in the present moment, rather than allowing my mind to drift toward the past or worry about an uncertain future. Around me, I could hear the low murmur of conversations about weather patterns and weekend plans, the beautifully mundane discussions that make up the fabric of ordinary lives. I found myself craving exactly that kind of ordinariness, not the manufactured drama of family politics and unspoken hierarchies, but the simple pleasure of existing without having to constantly justify my presence or defend my right to take up space. After lunch, I wandered outside and discovered a weathered wooden bench positioned beneath the spreading branches of an ancient maple tree. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, and as I settled onto the bench, several of them fluttered down around me in lazy spirals, landing softly on the grass at my feet. I picked up one of the fallen leaves, studying its intricate network of veins that reminded me of how fragile and interconnected all of our assumptions about life really are. I thought about Victoria's voicemails, some of which I imagined were probably indignant and accusatory, while others were likely pleading and tender, attempting to manipulate me through guilt and appeals to our shared history. She had reached out with a combination of love and manipulation that were so thoroughly tangled together that it was impossible to separate one from the other. And I realized that I needed to untangle my own heart from that same confusing mixture of genuine affection and toxic control. I folded the maple leaf carefully into the palm of my hand and closed my fingers around it, feeling its delicate structure beneath my skin. I understood suddenly that if I held on too tightly to the past, to the memories of better times, to the hope that things could somehow return to what they once were, I would inevitably crush whatever was still alive and growing inside me. The leaf was a perfect metaphor for the fragility of the human spirit when it's squeezed too hard by expectations and obligations that it was never meant to bear. So I opened my hand slowly and deliberately, allowing the leaf to fall gently to the grass below. Its trajectory was completely unpredictable, subject to the whims of the breeze and the laws of physics rather than my desire to control its path. It landed softly among its companions, becoming part of the natural cycle of death and renewal that governs all living things. That small moment of surrender felt weighted with meaning far beyond its simple action. It was a practice session for the much larger act of letting go that I knew was coming. The final release of my marriage, my old identity, and all the assumptions I had made about what my life was supposed to look like. I pulled out my phone and held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of the device and everything it represented. The screen was dark and silent, but I knew that underneath that peaceful surface, Victoria's desperation was accumulating like a digital storm. I thought about deleting all of her attempts to reach me at once, severing our connection with the same decisive finality that I had used to cut ties with the family table that had never truly felt like mine. But as I sat there on that bench with the autumn breeze stirring the leaves around my feet, I paused. Not because I was softening toward Victoria or reconsidering my decision to leave, but because I had come to recognize something essential about the nature of closure. Real closure wasn't about erasing history or pretending that painful experiences had never happened. It was about choosing consciously which parts of the past to carry forward into the future, and which parts to release with gratitude for the lessons they had taught me. I found myself thinking about the difference between running away from something and walking deliberately towards something else. For the past day and a half, I had been in full retreat mode, focused entirely on putting distance between myself and the source of my pain. But sitting under that maple tree, surrounded by the quiet evidence of natural cycles and seasonal change, I realized that I was ready to shift from escape to intentional movement toward a life that I actively wanted to create. I tapped the screen of my phone once, letting it ring twice before I answered Victoria's call. My decision wasn't motivated by weakness or second thoughts about my choice to leave. Instead, it came from a place of strength, the recognition that I was finally secure enough in my own worth to engage with her without being pulled back into old patterns of accommodation and self-denial. "Hello," I said simply, my voice steady and calm despite the emotional weight of the moment. Her response came immediately, relief flooding through the phone connection like water rushing through a broken dam. I could hear in that single word how desperate she had become, how the silence of the past day had shaken her more profoundly than any argument or confrontation could have. She had been expecting anger or demands for explanations, but my quiet withdrawal had forced her to confront the possibility that I might simply choose not to engage with her drama at all. I drank in that relief for a moment, not out of cruelty, but because it helped me understand how much power I had been giving away by always being available, always being ready to smooth over conflicts and minimize my own needs for the sake of keeping peace. Then I exhaled slowly, letting the tension flow out of my body with my breath. "I'm not coming back today," I said evenly, my words carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made rather than the uncertainty of someone who was still negotiating with himself. The silence that followed my statement stretched between us like a chasm, broken only by the distant sound of a car horn and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze around my bench. I could feel Victoria processing my words, trying to understand whether this was a temporary cooling-off period or something much more permanent and final. Finally, she asked the question that I knew had been eating at her since I had walked out of her parents' house. "Will you come back tomorrow?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the space between us settle and expand, the way silence settles on a dinner plate before the next course arrives. I wanted her to feel the weight of that pause, to understand that her assumption that I would eventually return to our normal routine was no longer something she could take for granted. "I need time," I said finally, my voice carrying a firmness that surprised even me. "Time to find out where I actually belong." She didn't respond to that, and for the first time in our entire relationship, her silence felt right. It felt like the natural conclusion to a conversation that had been building for years, the acknowledgement that we had finally reached the end of what words could accomplish between us. Because for the first time in 4 years, I was choosing my own rhythm over hers, following the beat of my own heart instead of trying to match the tempo that others had set for my life. The bench creaked softly under me as I stood up, and I folded the maple leaf in my palm once more before letting it fall to the ground for the final time. It didn't matter where it landed or how the wind carried it from that point forward. What mattered was that I had opened my hand, released my grip on the past, and listened carefully for the echo of my own heartbeat in the silence that followed. That echo was strong and steady and entirely my own, and it carried me forward into the afternoon with the confidence of a man who had finally learned to trust his own instincts. One deliberate step at a time, I was walking away from the version of myself that had begged for acceptance and approval, and toward a future where my presence would be celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Returning to the apartment that Victoria and I had shared felt like stepping through a portal into someone else's life, a life that I had somehow outgrown without fully realizing the transformation was taking place. The key turned in the lock with the same familiar resistance it had always had, and the door swung open to reveal the hollow hush of an empty home that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place where real people had once tried to build a future together. The faint scent of lilies still lingered in the entryway from the flowers Victoria had bought the week before, and books were still stacked precariously on the coffee table in the same haphazard arrangement I remembered from what now felt like a lifetime ago. All the photographs that had once hung proudly on our walls were now turned deliberately face down, their frames creating geometric shadows against the paint where happy memories had once been displayed. I set my travel bag down by the door and paused in the doorway, listening to the quality of quiet that I had been craving for so long, but now found surprisingly heavy and oppressive. Each piece of furniture in our living room, each carefully chosen decoration, each shared memory that had been frozen in time carried the weight of a life that had slowly unraveled over the course of a single dinner party, leaving behind only the hollow shell of what we had once believed our relationship could become. I closed my eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and let the reality of my situation sink fully into my consciousness. This space, these rooms that had once felt like home, no longer belonged to me in any meaningful way. The apartment had become a monument to a marriage that had died not from any single catastrophic event, but from the slow accumulation of small betrayals and casual dismissals that had eventually reached a critical mass. I walked through our living room with the careful deliberation of someone touring a historical site, and paused before the dresser in our bedroom where the afternoon sunlight was filtering through the blinds in golden bands that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. There, exactly where I had left it in what now seemed like another lifetime, lay my wedding ring. The small circle of gold that had once been the emblem of promise and commitment, but had become nothing more than a relic of a future that would never materialize. I knelt down and picked up the ring, turning it over slowly between my fingers while the metal caught and reflected the light streaming through the window. The band felt heavier than I remembered, weighted down with the accumulated disappointment of 4 years spent trying to build something meaningful with someone who had never been fully present in our relationship. The gold surface was smooth and unmarked, showing no signs of the emotional wear and tear that had characterized the marriage it was supposed to represent. I studied the ring for a long moment, remembering the day I had first slipped it onto my finger with such hope and optimism about what Victoria and I could create together. We had been so young then, so convinced that love would be enough to overcome any obstacles that life might place in our path. I had believed with absolute certainty that we were building something permanent and unshakable, something that could weather any storm. Beside the ring on the dresser sat a single photograph of Victoria and me, taken during our honeymoon when our smiles had been genuine and our eyes bright with the possibility of shared adventures. In the picture, we looked like two people who were completely oblivious to the fractures that were already beginning to form beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect relationship. I reached over and turned the photograph face down on the dresser, severing its power to hold me emotionally hostage to a version of our relationship that had probably never been as real as I had wanted to believe. The gesture felt sacred and ceremonial, like a ritual of release that marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of something entirely unknown, but infinitely more authentic. I slipped the ring off my finger with a sense of finality that surprised me with its completeness. There was no hesitation, no last-minute doubt about whether I was making the right decision. The metal band came away easily, leaving behind only a faint indentation on my skin that would fade within days, erasing the physical evidence of a commitment that had already died in every way that mattered. I placed the ring carefully on the dresser next to the overturned photograph, positioning it with the same precise attention to detail that Victoria had always insisted upon when arranging our living space. Then I stepped back and looked at the small tableau I had created. Two artifacts from a marriage that had run its course, displayed like items in a museum case dedicated to lessons learned and mistakes that would never be repeated. The feeling of release that washed over me in that moment was profound and immediate. My chest seemed to expand with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years, and I felt a lightness settle into my bones that was entirely foreign, but deeply welcome. I opened my suitcase on the bed and began the methodical process of packing my essential belongings. A couple of shirts, my favorite jeans, toiletries, and the few personal items that felt truly mine, rather than artifacts of our shared life. Each folded item that went into the bag was a small but significant declaration of independence, a concrete step toward a future that would be entirely of my own making. I was selective and deliberate in my choices, taking only what I needed to survive and thrive, leaving behind the accumulated detritus of a relationship that had been built more on hope than on genuine compatibility or mutual respect. I made a conscious decision to leave behind most of our shared possessions: the coffee mug that Victoria preferred for her morning tea, the throw pillow she had insisted matched the couch perfectly, the entire section of closet space that was filled with her sweaters and scarves, and the lingering scent of her perfume. Those items belonged to a woman who had made her choice clear through her silence and complicity, who had refused to acknowledge the depth of my pain or the legitimacy of my grievances against her family's treatment of me. When I finally zipped the suitcase shut and lifted it from the bed, I felt like I was closing the door on one version of my life and opening another. I stood for a moment in our bedroom doorway, running my hand through my hair and catching a glimpse of myself in the full-length mirror that Victoria had mounted on the closet door. The man looking back at me appeared less burdened somehow, more present and alert than he had been in years. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders, no longer hunched under the weight of constant disappointment and rejection. I could see it in his eyes, which had lost that chronic look of apology that had become his default expression in social situations. This was a man who had finally stopped asking permission to exist, who had reclaimed his right to take up space in the world without having to justify or minimize his presence. I stepped into the hallway, carrying my bag with a sense of purpose that felt entirely new, and heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the front door lock. My heart didn't race with panic or dread. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the composure that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and having no intention of apologizing for your position. I hadn't expected Victoria to return from wherever she had been so soon, but her timing felt almost cinematic, as if the universe had decided that this confrontation needed to happen for both of our sakes. She entered our apartment with the tentative movements of someone who was no longer sure of her welcome, her face pale and her eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from suddenly realizing that actions have consequences that can't be managed or controlled. She stammered something that sounded like it might have been an apology, but the words tangled and collapsed before they could reach my ears with any coherence. I watched her clutch her purse strap with white knuckles, as though the leather handle was the only thing tethering her to a world where she still had some measure of control over the narrative of our relationship. "Victoria," I said softly, though her name felt strange and unfamiliar on my tongue. like a word from a language I had once spoken fluently, but had somehow forgotten. The sound of my voice seemed to freeze her completely, and our apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary we had built together, suddenly felt like a courtroom where an important verdict was about to be delivered. The air between us was thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of years' worth of resentment that had finally found its voice. She took a tentative step forward as if to close the physical distance between us, but I remained firmly planted beside the door, my suitcase in hand and my resolve unshakable. "I packed a bag," I said, my voice steady and measured despite the emotional magnitude of what I was communicating. The words felt like a statement of fact, rather than an emotional declaration, and I realized that I had moved beyond the realm of hurt feelings and into the clearer territory of practical decision-making. "I'm staying elsewhere for a while," I continued, gesturing slightly toward the hallway that led back to the life I had been building before I understood how fundamentally incompatible we really were. The gesture was small, but loaded with meaning. It pointed toward a path I had traveled countless times as Victoria's husband, but which now felt like foreign territory that belonged to someone else entirely. Victoria blinked hard, her eyes filling with what looked like genuine tears, though I had learned over the years to be skeptical of emotional displays that seemed designed to manipulate rather than communicate. Her lips parted in a silent question that she seemed unable or unwilling to voice. And for a moment, the apartment felt suspended in time, as if we were both waiting for someone else to speak the words that would determine what happened next. She took another hesitant step forward and opened her mouth as if to launch into the kind of passionate speech that had resolved our conflicts in the past, but I interrupted her before she could begin, not out of anger or spite, but because I wanted to spare both of us the agony of hollow promises and explanations that would only make this already painful situation more drawn out and complicated than it needed to be. I wanted her to understand something important without my having to spell it out in cruel detail, that the gap between us had grown too wide to be bridged with words she had already proven herself unwilling to speak. The time for explanations and justifications and desperate attempts to minimize the damage had passed sometime during those long hours when I sat in a motel room listening to her voicemails pile up like accusations I wasn't ready to answer. Her shoulders sagged visibly, as if she had been holding herself upright through sheer force of will and had suddenly run out of the energy required to maintain that facade. The change in her posture told me that she had been expecting this confrontation, that on some level she had always known that the foundation of our marriage was more fragile than either of us had wanted to admit. "I didn't know they were planning to invite him tonight," she said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine distress. "They surprised me too, Trevor. I had no idea Nathan was going to show up." I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the air whoosh between us like a gust of truth that cleared away the last of the illusions I had been clinging to about our relationship. Her explanation felt both entirely predictable and completely inadequate, exactly the kind of response I had come to expect from someone who had spent years avoiding accountability for the ways her family's behavior had affected me. "You kissed him," I said quietly, my voice carrying no accusation or anger, just the simple statement of an observable fact that we both knew was true. "In front of me, and you didn't see that as a betrayal of our marriage." She hesitated for what felt like an eternity, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across her features as she tried to find words that would somehow make the situation less damaging than it actually was. Tears were gathering in her eyes now, threatening to spill over and create the kind of emotional scene that had often been effective in getting me to back down from positions that made her uncomfortable. But the words I needed to hear never came from her lips. There was no, "I'm sorry for hurting you." No, "I should have defended you." No desperate plea for forgiveness that acknowledged the magnitude of what had transpired at her parents' house. Instead, there was just that long, excruciating silence that communicated more clearly than any apology could have that she still didn't fully understand what she had done wrong. In that moment of profound quiet, I felt my heart settle into a place of acceptance that I hadn't expected to reach so quickly. The version of myself that had spent years enduring similar silences, that had begged for acknowledgement and validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it, was finally and completely gone. I felt a strange calm descend over me as I adjusted the strap of my travel bag and took a step toward the door. The decision that I had been wrestling with for the past day had suddenly become crystal clear, not because of anything Victoria had said, but because of everything she had failed to say when given the opportunity. I stepped back slightly, creating more physical distance between us while I gathered my thoughts and prepared to say what needed to be said. The elevator ride down to the lobby was going to be a slow descent into a completely different kind of clarity, and I wanted to make sure that both of us understood exactly what was happening and why it was necessary. My hands found the familiar weight of my car keys in my pocket, and I felt the cool metal against my palm like an anchor to the decision I was making. The engine's reliable hum was waiting for me in the parking garage, ready to carry me toward whatever came next with the same steady dependability that had gotten me through the worst night of my marriage. Before I could lose my nerve or be swayed by the tears that were now flowing freely down Victoria's cheeks, I made my final statement. Not as an angry husband seeking revenge, but as a man who had finally learned to value his own worth enough to walk away from situations that diminished it. I can see in your silence that you're comfortable with a routine that includes Nathan's return but excludes my dignity, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was acknowledging. You've made your choice, Victoria. Now I'm making mine. I let the apartment door click shut behind me with a firm finality that seemed to echo down the empty hallway like a gunshot in a cathedral. The sound reverberated off the walls and carried with it the weight of 4 years of marriage, 4 years of trying to build something meaningful with someone who had never been fully committed to the construction project we had supposedly been working on together. Victoria's face became a blur behind the frosted glass panel of our front door as I walked away, my shoulders straight and my steps deliberate. Each footfall created a steady rhythm against the carpeted floor that sounded like the first notes of a new beginning, a song I was finally ready to compose entirely on my own terms. The elevator ride down to the building's lobby felt like a descent into a fundamentally different kind of clarity. The familiar beige walls and fluorescent lighting that I had seen thousands of times as Victoria's husband now seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a place where I had once lived but could never return to, even if I wanted to. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, the pale overhead lights felt welcoming rather than harsh, as though the world outside our apartment was ready to receive me exactly as I was. Not as the accommodating son-in-law who had spent years trying to earn approval from people who were incapable of giving it, but as a man who had finally learned to approve of himself. Outside the building, I could hear the familiar sounds of our neighborhood humming with life that had nothing to do with the drama that had just unfolded upstairs. Children were laughing as they chased each other along the sidewalks, their voices bright with the uncomplicated joy that comes from games that have clear rules and predictable outcomes. Neighbors were chatting casually over the low hedges that separated their front yards, sharing gossip and observations about the changing weather with the easy intimacy of people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. Cars glided past on the street with their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, each one carrying people toward destinations that mattered to them, toward homes where they were wanted and appreciated rather than merely tolerated. None of this ordinary life belonged to the world I was leaving behind upstairs, where Victoria was probably standing in our living room trying to process what had just happened and whether there was any way to undo it. I walked to my car, which was parked across the street under the soft glow of a street lamp that had just flickered on as evening settled over the city. The familiar weight of my keys felt solid and reassuring in my hand as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat that had become my refuge over the past few days. The engine responded immediately to my touch, humming to life with the reliable warmth of a friend who had been waiting patiently for my return. I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a final glimpse of the apartment building where Victoria and I had tried to build a life together, where we had shared meals and conversations and the quiet routines that make up the fabric of domestic partnership. The windows of our apartment glowed softly in the darkness, illuminated from within by the same lamps we had chosen together during happier times when we still believed that good intentions and mutual attraction would be enough to overcome any obstacles life might place in our path. Those rooms had witnessed my compromises and her indifference, my attempts to belong and her family's systematic exclusion of me from their inner circle. As I shifted the car into drive and began to pull away from the curb, I thought about the empty picture frames I was leaving behind on our living room walls, the spaces where photographs of our shared happiness should have been displayed, but where only shadows remained. I thought about the wedding ring lying silent on the dresser upstairs and the overturned photograph that would serve as the only evidence that we had once believed in forever. Those artifacts marked the end of a chapter in my life that had been filled with polite smiles and quiet endurance, with Saturday dinners where I was treated like a guest who had overstayed his welcome and family gatherings where I was reminded constantly that I would never measure up to the ghost of Nathan Penn. But ahead of me lay a road that was unmarked by anyone else's expectations, open to whatever future I chose to create for myself. The afternoon light was fading into the soft gold of early evening, and I drove forward with the windows slightly cracked to let in the cool air that carried the scent of possibility and new beginnings. Each gear shift propelled me further from the man who had spent years tolerating being merely tolerated, and closer to a version of myself that I was still discovering, but already learning to respect. With every mile that passed beneath my wheels, I felt the exhilaration of uncharted horizons opening before me, the pure joy that comes from finally earning a seat at a table of your own choosing, rather than begging for acceptance at one where you were never truly welcome. The weeks that followed my departure passed in a blur of half-finished days and restless nights as I slowly rebuilt the fundamental routines of my existence. I began to construct new mornings that started with coffee and solitude rather than the immediate anxiety of checking my phone for messages that might contain criticism or demands. My afternoons were spent wandering city streets that I had never bothered to explore during my years with Victoria, discovering neighborhoods and cafes and bookstores that existed entirely outside the carefully mapped territory of our shared life. My evenings became sanctuaries of peace, where I could curl up with books that I had abandoned long ago when reading for pleasure had somehow transformed into another obligation to be managed around Victoria's schedule and her family's expectations. The sting of her silence during those crucial moments at her parents' house had gradually softened into a steady ache that served as a reminder of the lesson I was learning about the difference between being loved and being convenient. I was discovering what it meant to stand completely alone, not in the terrifying sense of isolation that I had always feared, but in the liberating sense of self-reliance that comes from knowing that your happiness doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or validation. For the first time in years, I was learning to be my own best company. Then, one afternoon, as I was sorting through the small pile of mail that had accumulated at my temporary address, an envelope arrived that seemed to glow with significance against the mundane backdrop of bills and advertisements. It was made of crisp white paper and sealed with blood-red wax that caught the light like a ruby. My name was written across the front in elegant, flowing script that spoke of formal occasions and careful attention to detail. Trevor Blake. I turned the envelope over in my hands, expecting to find some kind of legal document or business correspondence. But when I broke the crimson seal, the delicate stationery inside revealed its true purpose with unmistakable clarity. It was an invitation to Victoria's cousin's wedding, printed in gold filigree that seemed to shimmer against the cream-colored paper. Saturday, October 15th at the Moonlight Gardens estate, the invitation read in formal script. Reception to follow. The words were accompanied by intricate, decorative flourishes that spoke of celebration and new beginnings, concepts that felt both foreign and appealing to me in my current state of emotional transition. My first instinct was to toss the invitation aside without a second thought. After everything that had transpired, why would I want to attend a family gathering where I would once again be treated like an unwelcome intruder at someone else's celebration? The same people who had made me feel invisible for 4 years were now asking me to witness another chapter of their ongoing story, one that I had never truly been included in despite my years of effort and accommodation. But as I sat there holding the invitation, something unexpected stirred within me, a quiet but insistent sense of defiance that had been growing stronger with each day of independence. I began to realize that accepting this invitation on my own terms, showing up as the man I was becoming rather than the man I had been, could serve as a powerful test of how far I had traveled on my journey towards self-respect. The blood-red wax that had sealed the envelope reminded me of the bold red tie that Victoria had once criticized as too flashy and attention-seeking. At the time, I had accepted her judgment and relegated the tie to the back of my closet, choosing instead to wear the muted colors and conservative patterns that she preferred. But that red tie had been my choice, a small expression of my personality that I had allowed her to suppress in the name of keeping peace. I smiled at the memory, not with bitterness, but with a newfound appreciation for the symbolism it represented. That evening, I went to a men's clothing store and bought a new red tie, one that was even deeper and richer in color than the original, woven with subtle silver threads that caught the light when I moved. This tie would be mine and mine alone, worn not to please or appease anyone else, but as a banner of the confidence I was learning to claim as my birthright. At home, I spent time carefully preparing my outfit for the wedding, pressing a crisp white shirt until it was perfect, selecting a navy blazer and charcoal trousers that fit me better than any clothes I had worn during my marriage. I stood in front of my mirror, knotting the red tie just under my collar with the kind of attention to detail that comes from doing something entirely for yourself. The silk fabric slid through my fingers like a promise as I adjusted the length until it hung exactly at mid-belt, the tip pointing toward the small silver tie bar I had chosen to add subtle weight and sophistication to the ensemble. When I looked at my reflection, I wasn't seeing a man who was defined by other people's expectations and limitations. I was looking at someone who had reclaimed his own sense of style and was ready to show the world exactly who he was becoming. On the morning of the wedding, I took the invitation from my jacket pocket and slipped it into the inner breast pocket of my blazer, right next to my heart, where it would serve as a reminder of my purpose for being there. I also retrieved the wedding ring that I had once placed on the dresser in the apartment Victoria and I had shared, sliding it into my coat pocket not because I intended to wear it again, but because I wanted to acknowledge the weight of what it had once represented before finally letting it go. This was an old habit that I felt compelled to honor one last time, carrying a small piece of my past with me as I stepped deliberately into my future. The ring felt heavier than I remembered, loaded down with the accumulated disappointment and unfulfilled promises of 4 years spent trying to build something meaningful with someone who had never been fully committed to the construction project. I locked the door of my new apartment behind me and greeted the pale morning light with a sense of calm resolve that felt entirely foreign but deeply welcome. This time, I wasn't fleeing from pain or running away from an impossible situation. I was choosing to show up and stake my claim to a place in the world that I was creating entirely on my own terms, without apology or explanation to anyone who might question my right to be there. The Moonlight Gardens estate sat majestically at the end of a tree-lined drive that curved gracefully through perfectly manicured grounds. The main house was a vision of old-world elegance, with its white columns and symmetrical windows, surrounded by gardens that looked like they had been designed by someone who understood that beauty and order could coexist without sacrificing the wild unpredictability that makes nature truly alive. I parked my car at the far end of the expansive parking lot, choosing a spot that would allow me to observe the other guests as they arrived while giving me the option to leave quietly if the situation became too emotionally charged for me to handle with grace. As I walked along the gravel path toward the reception area, I felt the satisfying sway of my red tie catching occasional glints of sunlight, the silk moving with a confidence that seemed to announce my presence without requiring me to say a word. I could feel eyes on me as I approached the elegant white tent that had been erected for the reception, guests turning to notice the man walking alone in the bold red tie that stood out like a declaration of independence against the sea of conservative navy and gray that most of the other men were wearing. But instead of the familiar anxiety that had always accompanied social situations during my marriage, I felt energized by their attention, empowered by the knowledge that I was finally showing up as my authentic self rather than as someone else's carefully edited version of who I should be. I spotted Victoria's family clustered near the entrance to the reception tent, and for a moment, time seemed to stutter as I took in the familiar tableau of Margaret in her pastel silk and pearls, Robert sporting a crisp tuxedo that perfectly matched the formal elegance of the occasion, and Nathan standing beside them in a dark suit that somehow managed to look both expensive and effortless. But something was different about the energy surrounding their little group today. Nathan wasn't commanding the magnetic attention that I remembered from that disastrous dinner party weeks ago. There was something subdued about his presence, as if the passage of time had diminished his power to captivate and charm everyone around him into forgetting that other people existed. More importantly, I was carrying my own energy now, completely unbound by their expectations or approval. I had learned to generate my own sense of worth rather than depending on others to validate my existence, and that independence was visible in every aspect of my appearance and demeanor. Victoria's eyes found me across the crowd of arriving guests, and I watched her face register a complex mixture of surprise, recognition, and something that might have been regret. Her expression widened, as if she had forgotten that I existed as a separate person outside the context of our failed marriage, as if she hadn't expected me to continue functioning and thriving in the world without her presence to define my social interactions. For a brief moment that seemed to stretch like taffy between us, time felt suspended as we acknowledged each other's presence without words. Then, I turned my attention to the woman walking beside me, Sophia, a graphic designer I had met at a bookstore during one of my afternoon wanderings through the city. When I had called her several days earlier to ask if she would accompany me to this wedding, she had said yes without hesitation, not because she pitied me or felt sorry for my situation, but because she genuinely enjoyed my company and was curious about the event. Sophia wore a pale blue dress that complemented her warm complexion, and she carried a small sketchbook tucked under her arm like a talisman, evidence of her artistic nature and creative spirit. Her eyes lit up with genuine warmth when she saw me approaching, not with the calculated sympathy that people sometimes show divorced men, but with the authentic pleasure that comes from spending time with someone whose company you actually value. "This is Sophia," I said to Victoria's family as we reached their small circle, extending my hand in a gesture that was both polite and confident. "Sophia, I'd like you to meet Victoria's family." Sophia didn't flinch or show any signs of intimidation as she shook hands with Margaret and Robert, her presence calm and self-assured in a way that spoke of someone who was comfortable in her own skin and didn't need anyone else's approval to feel worthy of taking up space in the world. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Sophia told Margaret, with a smile that was both warm and genuine, then turned to Nathan with a polite nod that acknowledged his presence without betraying any awareness of the complicated history that surrounded his relationship with his family. Nathan managed a stiff smile in response, as though he was surprised to encounter someone who seemed completely unafraid of his legendary charm and charisma. For the first time since I had known of his existence, he appeared slightly off balance, uncertain how to navigate a social interaction with someone who didn't already know his story, or feel compelled to treat him like visiting royalty. I felt a thrill of satisfaction at this small but significant shift in the social dynamics that had once seemed so immutable and unchangeable. I hadn't invited Sophia to the wedding simply for companionship, though I genuinely enjoyed her company and valued her perspective on art and life. I had invited her as a living, breathing statement, proof that I was capable of forming connections with people who saw me clearly, who respected my thoughts and opinions, and whose confidence and self-worth never hinged on anyone else's approval or validation. As we stepped toward the registration table where guests were signing the elaborate leather-bound guest book, I felt Sophia's arm slip naturally through mine, in a gesture that spoke of comfortable familiarity rather than romantic attachment. We had developed an easy friendship over the past few weeks, built on shared interests in literature and long conversations about creativity and independence that felt like a revelation after years of marriage to someone who had never really been curious about my inner world. Victoria's cousin Vivian was standing near the guest book, radiant in her wedding dress and practically glowing with the happiness that comes from marrying someone who genuinely wants to build a life with you. When she saw me approaching, her face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure and surprise. "Trevor!" she exclaimed, embracing me with the kind of warmth that I had spent 4 years hoping to receive from other members of Victoria's family. "I'm so glad you made it. I wasn't sure if you'd be able to come, given everything that's been happening." My chest tightened with an unexpected wave of emotion at her words. Here was someone from Victoria's extended family who seemed to understand that I was a real person with real feelings. Someone who recognized that the end of my marriage might have created complications around family gatherings like this one. Her acknowledgement of my situation felt like a small but precious gift, the validation I had been craving for so long, offered freely by someone who barely knew me, but chose to see me as worthy of consideration. "Thank you for including me," I replied, meaning every word. "It means more than you know to be welcomed here." This moment felt like a small but significant victory, a crack in the wall of indifference that had surrounded me at Victoria's family gatherings for so many years. Standing there in the warm afternoon sun, wearing my red tie like a flag of independence, I was finally claiming my space in their world on my own terms rather than begging for acceptance on theirs. Inside the reception tent, the afternoon was unfolding with music floating through the white-draped ceilings and rows of elegant chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, beside a small stage where the wedding ceremony would take place. The atmosphere was festive and welcoming, filled with the kind of genuine celebration that comes from people who are truly happy to witness two people committing their lives to each other. I found my assigned seat at a beautifully decorated table, labeled with a small card that read, "Trevor Blake and Guest," in elegant calligraphy. The fact that the wedding planners had anticipated that I might bring someone with me felt like another small acknowledgement of my independent existence, proof that I was seen as a complete person rather than just half of a couple that no longer existed. Sophia settled into the chair beside me with the graceful ease of someone who was comfortable in social situations without needing to be the center of attention. The table's centerpiece was a simple but elegant arrangement of wildflowers, fresh, unpretentious, and perfectly suited to the outdoor setting. It felt like a refreshing change from the elaborate formal displays that Margaret favored, a reminder that beauty didn't always have to be intimidating or exclusive. The other guests at our table were a mix of Vivian's friends and extended family members, people who greeted us with the kind of casual friendliness that made conversation flow naturally. They asked about my work and my interests with genuine curiosity, and I found myself relaxing into the kind of social interaction that felt like a homecoming after years of feeling like an outsider looking in. When the best man rose to give his toast, I noticed that his speech was an affectionate and witty tribute to Vivian's childhood adventures and her journey to finding love with her new husband. Midway through his remarks, he paused and seemed to recalibrate his audience, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests before landing on me. "And I see we have some special guests here today," he continued with a warm smile, "including Trevor, who has traveled far, not just in miles, but in becoming the man standing here today." A ripple of laughter and applause spread across the tent, and I felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with recognition. This stranger was acknowledging my journey, my growth, my transformation from someone who had accepted less than he deserved into someone who demanded to be seen and valued for exactly who he was. Victoria's eyes met mine from across the elegantly decorated tent, and in that moment of silent connection, I saw something complex and multi-layered in her expression. She lifted her champagne glass in what appeared to be a toast directed specifically at me, her gesture carrying undertones of acknowledgement that I couldn't quite decipher. I caught her gaze and raised my own glass in return, the crystal catching the warm afternoon light like a prism. My red tie hung between us like a banner of the transformation I had undergone, its bold color catching and reflecting the golden sunlight that filtered through the tent's white fabric ceiling. For a single heartbeat, our complicated history flickered in the space between our raised glasses. All the shared memories, all the missed opportunities, all the words that had been spoken and unspoken during our years together. The moment was weighted with regret and admiration in equal measure, a bittersweet acknowledgement of what we had tried to build together and what had ultimately proven impossible to sustain. Then I deliberately turned my attention back to Sophia, who was smiling at me with eyes that sparkled with genuine affection and respect rather than the complicated mixture of obligation and resentment that had characterized my interactions with Victoria during the final months of our marriage. I realized in that moment that I didn't need Victoria's approval or validation anymore. I was finally secure enough in my own worth to receive her gesture of acknowledgement without being pulled back into the gravitational field of our shared dysfunction. I could appreciate the recognition she was offering while remaining firmly grounded in the new life I was building for myself. When the music swelled to signal the beginning of the dancing portion of the reception, I stood and extended my hand to Sophia with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and with whom you want to share your time. Her fingers slipped into mine with easy familiarity, and we moved together toward the dance floor that had been set up on the cool grass beneath the spreading branches of ancient oak trees. The evening air was perfect for dancing, warm but not oppressive, with a gentle breeze that stirred the leaves overhead and created shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground below our feet. The sunset was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink that made the entire scene feel magical, like something out of a fairy tale where happy endings were not only possible, but inevitable. As we moved together to the slow, melodic rhythm of the waltz that was playing, I felt a profound sense of joy and liberation that had nothing to do with revenge or proving a point to anyone who might be watching. This was pure celebration, the exhilaration of finally understanding what it felt like to be genuinely appreciated by someone who had chosen to be in my company because they wanted to be there. Not because social convention or family pressure had obligated them to tolerate my presence. I glanced over to see Victoria standing at the edge of the dance floor, her arms crossed over her chest and her gaze fixed on Sophia and me with an expression that was difficult to read. There was something that looked like regret in her eyes, mixed with a longing that suggested she was finally beginning to understand what she had lost when she chose her family's comfort over her husband's dignity. But she remained silent, standing as a spectator to the happiness I had found without her, rather than as an active participant in my journey towards self-respect and genuine connection with others. Her silence felt like the natural conclusion to our relationship. Not angry or bitter, but simply final, like the last note of a song that had run its course. I spared her one more look, steady and compassionate, but without any trace of malice or desire for reconciliation. It was the gaze of someone who had moved beyond resentment into acceptance, someone who could acknowledge the role she had played in his growth without needing her to validate the lessons he had learned. Then I turned my full attention back to Sophia, allowing the gentle rhythm of the music to carry us across the dance floor as the evening deepened around us. Sophia's laughter was warm and genuine in my ear as I guided her through the steps of the waltz, her voice bright with the kind of unguarded happiness that comes from being truly present in a moment rather than calculating how that moment might benefit or harm your social standing. Around us, other couples moved with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm, but none shared the same sense of pure exhilaration that I was experiencing. For the first time in years, I was dancing not because it was expected of me or because it would help me fit in with a group that had never really wanted me there in the first place. I was dancing because I wanted to dance, with someone who wanted to dance with me, in celebration of possibilities that stretched as far as the imagination could reach. When the song ended, scattered applause from the other wedding guests encouraged us to stay on the makeshift dance floor for another song. Sophia and I moved together with increasing confidence and synchronization, and I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from finally standing on solid ground after years of trying to maintain your balance on constantly shifting terrain. After the music faded and the dancing came to a natural pause, Sophia and I made our way to the sidelines where we could catch our breath and enjoy glasses of champagne beneath the string lights that had been hung throughout the trees. The soft glow of those lights created an enchanted atmosphere, illuminating faces that were filled with genuine warmth and celebration, rather than the forced politeness that had characterized so many of the social gatherings I had attended during my marriage. We found ourselves drawn into conversations with friends of Sophia's and several new acquaintances I had made during the course of the evening. These were people who had chosen to include me in their discussions about art exhibitions, travel adventures, and dreams that had yet to be realized, not because they felt obligated by family connections or social conventions, but because they found my company genuinely interesting and valuable. Each word spoken by someone who had actively chosen to engage with me felt like another brick being laid in the foundation of a new kind of home, one built on mutual respect and authentic connection rather than tolerance and accommodation. The difference was so profound that I wondered how I had survived for so long on the thin gruel of acceptance that had been offered to me at Victoria's family gatherings. It was during one of these conversations that I spotted Robert approaching our small group, his tuxedo now slightly rumpled from hours of celebration, and his normally rigid posture softened by what appeared to be several glasses of champagne and genuine enjoyment of the festivities. He stopped directly in front of me, and for a moment I braced myself for another cutting remark or dismissive comment disguised as paternal wisdom. Instead, his voice carried a note of hesitation that I had never heard from him before. "Trevor," he began, the single word hanging in the air between us like a confession waiting to be made. "I haven't said this before, and I realize now that I should have said it a long time ago, but you look genuinely happy tonight." His words were simple and unadorned, yet they carried the weight of his own obvious astonishment at the transformation he was witnessing. This was the same man who had spent years correcting my table manners and questioning my career choices, who had dismissed my opinions and interrupted my stories as if my thoughts were somehow less valuable than those of other people at his dinner table. Now he was standing before me with something that looked remarkably like respect, acknowledging not just my presence, but the positive energy I was bringing to this celebration. The father-in-law who had once treated me like an unwelcome intruder was finally seeing me as a person worthy of consideration and genuine regard. I nodded slowly, allowing the significance of this moment to settle between us like the final chord of a long-awaited symphony. "Thank you, Robert," I replied with sincerity that came from a place of strength rather than desperation. "That means more than you know." It was a moment of grace that felt both surprising and somehow inevitable, as if the universe had been waiting for both of us to evolve enough to have this conversation with dignity and mutual respect. I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand that worthiness wasn't something that had to be earned through endless accommodation and self-denial, but something that existed as a fundamental birthright of every human being. Margaret appeared at Robert's side a moment later, her pearls catching the light from the string lights overhead as she moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime managing social situations with calculated grace. She offered me a tentative smile that seemed to reach her eyes for the first time in all the years I had known her, transforming her usually sharp features into something softer and more genuinely welcoming. "You carry that red tie very well, Trevor," she remarked quietly, and I could hear in her voice that this was more than just a polite compliment about my fashion choices. She was acknowledging something deeper, my right to take up space in the world on my own terms, to make choices based on my own preferences, rather than constantly deferring to other people's opinions about who I should be and how I should present myself. I inclined my head graciously in acknowledgement of her words, feeling the silk of my tie shift slightly against my collar as I moved. "It's mine now," I replied with quiet confidence, "and I'll carry it wherever I go." The statement was both literal and metaphorical, a declaration that I had finally claimed ownership, not just of my clothing choices, but of my entire identity. I was no longer the man who asked permission to exist or apologized for taking up space that belonged to me by right. I was someone who had learned to value his own opinions and trust his own instincts, regardless of whether those choices met with universal approval. Margaret glanced briefly at Sophia, who was standing beside me with the relaxed confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, then looked back at me with what appeared to be dawning understanding. I could see the moment when she realized that identity and self-worth weren't defined by other people's approval, but by the courage to choose authenticity over acceptance, individual truth over group consensus. Victoria was the next to approach our small gathering, her steps deliberate and measured as she navigated between the other wedding guests who were scattered across the lawn in various states of celebration and conversation. Her heels clicked softly against the wooden platform that had been constructed for the reception, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo in my chest like a heartbeat from a life I had once lived, but could barely remember now. When she reached our group, she paused for a moment as if gathering courage for whatever she was about to say. I could see her inhaling sharply, the way someone does when they're summoning words that don't come easily or naturally. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from the garden borders, and the warm glow of the lanterns created an almost dreamlike atmosphere that made this encounter feel both surreal and somehow predestined. "Trevor," she said finally, her voice carrying a tremor that spoke of genuine emotion rather than calculated manipulation. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you." The word proud hung in the air between us like a bridge spanning years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. It was a word I had never expected to hear from her lips, especially not in this context, surrounded by her family and friends at a celebration that highlighted everything our own marriage had failed to become: pride. It was such a simple concept, yet it carried the weight of recognition and respect that I had been seeking from her throughout our entire relationship. Coming from Victoria now, after everything that had transpired between us, it felt both precious and somehow bittersweet. A gift offered too late to change our trajectory, but meaningful nonetheless in its acknowledgement of the journey I had taken. I looked directly into her eyes, seeing both the apology that she couldn't quite bring herself to speak aloud, and a quiet hope that perhaps we could find some way to reconnect on entirely new terms. But as I studied her expression, I could sense that our paths had diverged too fundamentally for any kind of meaningful reconciliation to be possible. Her life still carried the melodies of obligation and family expectation, while mine had begun to follow an entirely different rhythm, one that prioritized authenticity over approval and personal growth over social convenience. We had become people who spoke different languages, even when we were using the same words. "I'm proud of myself too," I answered gently, my voice carrying neither accusation nor regret, but simply the calm acknowledgement of someone who had finally learned to validate his own worth rather than depending on others to provide that validation for him. The response seemed to surprise her, as if she had expected me to either reject her gesture or use it as an opening to negotiate some kind of emotional reconciliation between us. Instead, I was offering her something much simpler and perhaps more generous: acceptance of what had been and openness to what might come, without any attachment to controlling or manipulating the outcome. "Thank you for saying that," I continued, offering her a small smile that carried neither bitterness nor false hope, but simply the recognition of two people who had shared something meaningful, even if it hadn't ultimately been sustainable. She nodded as if she were releasing the final piece of our shared history, stepping back into the soft glow of the lanterns that surrounded the reception area. I watched her rejoin the swirl of guests who were lost in their own conversations and celebrations, and I felt something profound settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a sense of completion that comes from finally understanding that some chapters in life are meant to end so that new ones can begin. Sophia slipped her arm through mine with the natural ease of someone who understood that she was witnessing something significant without needing to analyze or comment on its meaning. She guided me toward a quieter corner of the celebration where we could observe the festivities from a slight distance, surrounded by the gentle murmur of satisfied conversation and the distant sound of laughter that spoke of genuine joy rather than social obligation. "You look different," she whispered, leaning close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my ear. "You're more alive somehow." Her words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, illuminating something that I had been feeling but hadn't quite been able to articulate even to myself. "I feel alive," I replied, my voice steady and sure in a way that surprised me with its confidence. "For the first time in a very long time, I know exactly where I belong." We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration unfold around us like a living painting of human connection and joy. The string lights continued to weave constellations among the tree branches overhead, and the evening air carried the music and laughter of people who had chosen to spend this time together because they genuinely wanted to witness and celebrate something beautiful. This was what belonging actually felt like. Not the desperate scramble for acceptance that had characterized my relationship with Victoria's family, but the quiet confidence that comes from being surrounded by people who see you clearly and choose to include you in their world because they value what you bring to it. As the reception continued to unfold around us, I realized that this evening represented something much more significant than simply attending a family wedding or proving a point about my independence. I was walking into the celebration tent just as the sun slipped behind the majestic oak trees that bordered the estate grounds, casting long amber shadows over the white linen tables and scattering the gentle laughter of the guests in pools of warm, golden light. The music that floated through the evening air was a slow, melodic waltz that seemed to beckon couples toward the dance floor with its romantic rhythm and timeless elegance. I felt a profound thrill of possibility coursing through my veins as I tightened my grip on Sophia's hand, the connection between us feeling both new and somehow inevitable, like we were meant to find each other at exactly this moment in both of our lives. My red tie continued to feel like a banner of authentic selfhood, its vibrant colors standing out boldly against the crisp white of my shirt and serving as a visible reminder that I had finally learned to honor my own preferences rather than constantly deferring to what others thought was appropriate or acceptable. Tonight, nothing about this celebration belonged to the old dynamics that had defined my relationship with Victoria's family for so many years. Nathan was no longer the magnetic center of attention that had dominated every gathering during my marriage. Margaret's delicate smile no longer carried the power to make me feel inadequate or unwelcome. Victoria's measured nods of recognition no longer had the ability to determine my sense of self-worth or belonging. Tonight, I belonged entirely to myself, and that ownership felt like the most precious gift I had ever received. Victoria remained at the edge of the dance floor throughout the evening, her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture as her gaze followed Sophia and me with an expression that seemed to combine regret with longing. There was something in her face that suggested she was finally beginning to understand what she had lost when she chose her family's comfort and Nathan's familiarity over her husband's dignity and emotional well-being. But her realization came too late to change the trajectory of our relationship, and she continued to remain silent rather than taking any active steps to repair the damage that had been done. She was a spectator to the happiness I had discovered without her, watching from the sidelines as I celebrated my liberation with someone who had chosen to be in my company because she genuinely enjoyed my presence. I offered Victoria one final look across the dance floor, steady, compassionate, and completely free of malice or any desire for reconciliation. It was the gaze of someone who had moved far beyond resentment into genuine acceptance, someone who could acknowledge the painful lessons of the past without needing the person who had taught them to validate or approve of the growth that had resulted. Then I turned my complete attention back to Sophia, allowing the gentle rhythm of the waltz to carry us across the makeshift dance floor as the evening deepened into night around us. Her laughter was warm and unguarded in my ear as I guided her through the steps, her voice bright with the kind of spontaneous joy that comes from being fully present in a moment rather than calculating how that moment might affect your social standing or reputation. Around us, other couples moved with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm, but none seemed to share the same sense of pure exhilaration that was flowing through my entire being. I wasn't dancing because it was expected of me, or because it would help me fit into a group that had spent years making it clear I wasn't really welcome. I was dancing because I wanted to dance, with someone who wanted to dance with me, in celebration of possibilities that stretched as limitlessly as the star-filled sky above us. The music swelled and shifted, encouraging couples to remain on the grass dance floor for another song, and then another. Sophia and I moved together with increasing confidence and natural synchronization, our steps becoming more fluid and intuitive as we learned to anticipate each other's movements and respond to the subtle cues that make dancing feel less like a performance and more like a conversation conducted entirely through motion and touch. I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally standing on completely solid ground after spending years trying to maintain balance on constantly shifting terrain. Every step, every turn, every moment of connection with Sophia reinforced my understanding that I had finally found my way to a place where I could be authentically myself without apology or explanation. The string lights overhead continued to create moving patterns of illumination as they swayed gently in the evening breeze, and I realized that I was no longer searching for a seat at someone else's table. Instead, I was learning to appreciate the fact that I had built my own table, surrounded by people who had chosen to join me there because they valued what I brought to their lives. As the reception gradually drew to a close and the evening settled into that magical hour when celebrations transform from active festivities into gentle, contemplative gatherings, Sophia and I found ourselves walking back toward the edge of the estate grounds. The night sky had become a magnificent tapestry of infinite possibility, with stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet, each one representing a potential future that I was now free to explore on my own terms. The music from the reception continued to drift through the warm evening air behind us, but it had softened into background melody that provided a soundtrack for the quiet conversations and satisfied laughter of wedding guests who were beginning to wind down from the celebration. The whole scene felt like the perfect conclusion to an evening that had served as both a celebration of new beginnings and a peaceful farewell to old patterns that no longer served any constructive purpose in my life. I paused at the edge of the driveway, near the spot where my car was parked among the other vehicles that would soon carry guests back to their own lives and their own stories. Looking back at the Moonlight Gardens estate, I could see the warm glow of lights still illuminating the reception tent and the main house, creating a picture of celebration and community that would remain in my memory not as a reminder of exclusion, but as evidence of what was possible when people chose to include rather than isolate, to celebrate rather than compete. The house that had once represented everything I couldn't access or earn through good behavior and endless accommodation now stood as the backdrop to my liberation rather than my limitation. It was the stage where I had finally learned to value my own worth over other people's approval, where I had discovered that belonging wasn't something that could be granted by others, but something that had to be claimed from within. I turned to Sophia, who was standing beside me with her face tilted toward the star-filled sky, and felt a surge of gratitude for her presence during this pivotal moment in my personal journey. She had been more than just a companion for the evening. She had been a living reminder that there were people in the world who were capable of seeing and appreciating my authentic self without requiring me to diminish or apologize for who I was. "Thank you," I said simply, "for being my seat at the table tonight." The phrase carried multiple layers of meaning that I knew she would understand without requiring detailed explanation. She had literally shared a table with me at the wedding reception, but more importantly, she had provided me with the experience of being genuinely welcomed and valued in a social setting where I had once felt like an unwanted intruder. She smiled with eyes that sparkled with shared joy and understanding, reaching out to squeeze my hand in a gesture that spoke of friendship, support, and the quiet recognition that we had both witnessed something significant and transformative during the course of the evening. Together, we crossed the gravel parking area toward my car, our footsteps creating a gentle rhythm against the small stones that had been carefully arranged to provide both function and aesthetic appeal. The sound of our movement seemed to echo the measured pace of someone who is no longer rushing toward an uncertain future, but walking deliberately into a life that held promise and possibility in equal measure. As we drove away from the Moonlight Gardens estate, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from completing a journey that had been years in the making. The warm glow of the estate's lights gradually faded in my rearview mirror, but instead of sadness or regret, I felt only the exhilaration of forward momentum and the anticipation of discoveries yet to be made. The road ahead was illuminated by my headlights, revealing just enough of the path to guide us safely toward whatever came next. I didn't need to see the entire route mapped out in advance. I had learned to trust my ability to navigate challenges as they arose, to make decisions based on my own values and instincts rather than constantly seeking approval from others who might not have my best interests at heart. Beside me, Sophia was content to ride in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out constellations through the windshield or sharing quiet observations about the evening we had just experienced. Her presence was neither demanding nor overwhelming, but simply complimentary. The kind of companionship that enhanced rather than diminished my sense of individual identity and purpose. The night air flowing through the slightly opened windows carried the mingled sense of jasmine and possibility, and I realized that I had finally reached the destination I had been searching for without even knowing it existed. It wasn't a geographic location or a social position or a relationship status. It was the internal state of knowing exactly who I was and being completely comfortable with that knowledge. As we drove through the quiet streets that would carry us back to our respective homes and our separate but intersecting lives, I understood that this evening had been about much more than attending a wedding or proving a point about my independence. It had been a celebration of choice. My choice to value authenticity over acceptance, courage over comfort, and self-respect over the false security of relationships that required me to minimize my own worth in order to maintain them. The seat I had longed for at Victoria's family table had lost all of its appeal the moment I realized that I could build my own table, surrounded by people who chose to join me there because they genuinely valued what I brought to their lives. Tonight, I wasn't just attending someone else's celebration, I was actively creating my own.